Hi, everybody. Tonight, let me take you on a long and gentle journey, one that will slowly wind its way through the rain-soaked trenches, through the smoky cookhouses and shattered farms, through the quiet desperation and strange comforts that marked a soldier's daily bread during the First World War. This is not a tale of generals or strategies, not a study of sweeping offensives or grand turning points. It is something much smaller, yet no less significant. A story of how men, buried in mud and shadow, ate, how they scavenged, rationed, shared, and remembered food, not just as nourishment, but as memory, hope, and even rebellion. We will walk beside them across 24 softly spoken chapters, gently exploring what it meant to be hungry, full, or homesick with just a taste. Let's begin. It is early November 1914. The war is still young, just months old, but the optimism has already begun to rot like bread, forgotten in the bottom of a kit bag. The first frost bites at the cheeks of soldiers on both sides as they crouch low in trenches newly carved into the rolling fields of Belgium and France. The earth, recently churned by shell and shovel, clings to their boots like memory. Already, rumors pass down the line, not just about enemy movements or incoming artillery, but about food. You see, the army had promised food, hot meals, reliable rations, biscuits and bully beef, bread and jam, tea with condensed milk, and perhaps something better when the supply lines were strong. But out here, promises felt very far away. The men are learning to live with hunger, not as a passing sensation, but a constant low hum just behind their thoughts. And yet, they adapt. They always do. Let's pause here for a moment. Picture Private William Davies, 22 years old, Welsh miner by trade. His fingers still carry the strength of swinging a pickaxe, but they tremble slightly as he lifts his mess tin from the small fire, carefully hidden from aerial view. The stew inside is barely warm. It's made of hardtack biscuits soaked until soft, mixed with a little meat paste and whatever root vegetables the cook sergeant could scrounge or barter from nearby villagers. It is not good, but it is hot. And right now, that makes all the difference. Private Davies smiles faintly as the steam hits his nose. He remembers Sunday dinner at home, his mom's lamb stew, thick with barley and potatoes, served with hunks of crusty bread. He closes his eyes just a moment, long enough to let that memory overlay the taste of iron-rich beef dripping from the tin. It almost works. Almost. Nearby, two Canadians from the Princess Patricia's Light Infantry are sharing a tin of Mackinaw stew, a preserved meal of turnips, carrots, beans, and fatty meat. It's been heavily criticized for its smell and texture, especially when eaten cold. But today, it's warm enough to pass for edible. They joke, calling it muck and ochi, laughing quietly under their breath as they each take turns dipping their spoons. One of them, Corporal Harris, has brought a twist of salt he'd saved from a week ago. He sprinkles it in and grins as though he's added truffles and wine. Meals like these were rarely solo affairs. Food became communal, a reason to talk, to barter, to gather and whisper stories of back home or speculate on leave. And in the food itself, soldiers found echoes of home, even when the taste was poor. A crust of bread from a Red Cross package, a tin of sardines from an old friend, or even the treasured plum and apple jam stamped a gift from the people of Canada. Sometimes food arrived with letters, packages wrapped in brown paper, tied with string. Inside, hand-knitted socks, tins of toffee, fruitcake, or even a slab of lard lovingly sent by a mother who thought it might keep you strong. And the cake, dear reader, oh, the cake. Soldiers would open these parcels with trembling hands as though they held relics. Fruitcake soaked in rum, wrapped in wax paper, sometimes months old. Dry, certainly, but sweet, a whisper of home in every bite. Let's not pretend it was all nostalgia and warmth. There were bitter days, long ones when rations failed to arrive, or when supply lines were shelled to dust. On those days, men gnawed on hardtack so dry it could chip a tooth, soaked it in tea or broth just to avoid bleeding gums. Sometimes a lone rat caught in the dugout became the day's meat. Desperate measures, taken in silence, with eyes that did not meet each other's. Rats, in fact, were both enemy and companion. They devoured stores, spoiled food, ran over sleeping bodies. But sometimes they were caught, cooked over a spirit stove, and eaten with grim resignation. One diary entry from a French soldier near Verdun reads, "We skinned it, cooked it with onion from a broken cart. It was not bad, not good, but not bad." By night, things changed. With the stars overhead and the occasional lull in fire, soldiers would gather close, sharing stories and cigarette ends. And sometimes, when fortune favored them, they would pass around a bottle of rum. Issued daily by some armies, it became more than drink. It was ritual, warmth, numbness, a brief veil over the sharp edges of fear and cold. The British famously had their tea. Issued with condensed milk and sugar, it was brewed in every corner of the front, often blackened by the same tin used to boil stew, but still sacred. It didn't matter if the water had a smoky taste or if it had come from a shell hole filtered through a sock. Tea was life. A soldier without tea was not quite himself. In the German trenches, food was at first far more structured. Dark rye bread, sausages, smoked meats, and tins of cheese. But by 1915, even their well-oiled supply system began to fray. Ersatz products, substitutes took over. Coffee made from roasted acorns, bread cut with sawdust, meat stretched with flour. Morale, like the bread, began to crumble. Still, in each trench, regardless of flag or language, mealtime brought a strange stillness. Even when shells burst in the distance or rain poured endlessly from the heavens, men took time to eat. It was survival, yes, but also rhythm. Something known, something repeated, and that made it precious. And so, with Private Davies scraping the last bits of biscuit stew from his tin, with Corporal Harris licking his fingers clean of the Makinoshi's oily remnants, and with a dozen others across 100 miles doing just the same, the day begins to end. The cold deepens. The scent of stew and paraffin hangs in the air like memory, and across the trench lines, perhaps for a few brief hours, everything is quiet. Let us rest here for a moment. We've only just begun to understand how food was more than fuel. It was memory, ritual, resistance, and we have much more to discover in the long shadow of this war. Just say the word when you're ready for the next part. The next morning begins with a soft drizzle. Rainwater collects along the duckboards and flows in winding rivulets down the trench walls, carving miniature canyons into the mud. Men shift in their dugouts, grumble under their breath, and slowly come to life beneath the gray haze of dawn. There is no bugle, no reveille, only the soft hiss of rain and the distant cough of a machine gun in the mist. In these early hours, the thoughts of food are already creeping in like the damp into their socks. Breakfast in the trenches is not what one might imagine. There is no frying pan, no eggs or bacon, no buttered toast or fresh orange marmalade. Instead, there is a mess tin, dented and blackened by many fires, and within it, something that might be porridge. Oats if you're lucky, barley if you're not. Sometimes, when the supplies have traveled well, a man might be given a spoonful of golden syrup or a small smear of plum jam to mix in. Most often, though, it's plain, salty, and dense. This morning, Private John Allard of the 1st Essex Regiment stirs his porridge slowly. He sits on a small wooden crate that once carried biscuits, now covered in a cloth sack to make it seem like a chair. His back leans against the dugout wall, slick with moisture, and his breath forms little clouds as he exhales. He eats in silence, the only sound the scrape of his spoon against tin. The porridge isn't warm enough. The fire didn't light properly in the rain, but it's something. And for Allard, something is far better than nothing. Further down the line, in a makeshift field kitchen dug into the side of a shallow ravine, a cook named Corporal Ernest Malloy is busy with the morning meal. His hands are red from the cold, and his mustache is thick with condensation. A large iron pot bubbles in front of him, filled with tea, strong enough to paint a fence. He lifts the lid, peers inside, and gives it a stir with a wooden paddle. Then he turns to the smaller pot next to it, containing the remnants of last night's beef stew, and begins to divide it into smaller tins. This stew will be today's midday ration, or perhaps dinner. There's no telling when the men will eat it. The schedule bends with the weather, the shelling, and the occasional enemy push. Food waits on war, not the other way around. Corporal Malloy reaches into a sack of hardtack and withdraws a handful. Each biscuit is thick, square, and pale as bone. They knock together with a sound like wood blocks. He lays them out one by one, tapping each to ensure it isn't already moldy. Even these biscuits, meant to last for years, sometimes decay in the damp. The trench is no place for food to thrive. The cold keeps meat from rotting too quickly, but it also makes it harder to cook. The damp spoils sugar, flour, and biscuits. Mice and rats invade every supply cache, yet somehow, every day, there is something, a tin, a chunk, biscuit, a cup. The Germans across no man's land are eating too. They, like the British, have noticed the decline in quality. In the early months of the war, German rations were generous: bread, sausage, butter, even cheese. But the British naval blockade is beginning to squeeze the supply chain. Ersatz becomes the new word, replacement. Ersatz coffee, made from chicory or beetroot. Ersatz butter, whipped from lard and flavorings. Even ersatz sausage with more filler than meat. But German trench cooking is organized. Field kitchens are set further back, connected by narrow gauge rail lines and hand carts. Hot meals are more common, and the men take pride in preserving a sense of order around their food. Every company has its cook, its recipes, its rituals. One German diary tells of a trench where the men constructed a tiny brick oven using discarded stones and artillery shell casings. They baked flatbread over the course of 2 hours. The process, more than the result, was what mattered. The act of baking became an act of defiance, a way to declare, if only for an afternoon, that civilization had not entirely died in the mud. And indeed, food often carried that weight. When letters from home described family meals, Sunday roasts, pickled herring, or mother's custard, the longing they stirred wasn't just for flavor. It was for the entire world that meal represented. A world where time passed gently, where meals were prepared with care, not ladled from an iron drum into a rusted cup. By afternoon, the rain has turned to mist. Fog coils low over the trench lines like a shroud. In the lull between duties, men cluster near the cookhouse to receive their next ration. 10 cups outstretched, they line up without a word. The air smells of tinned meat, onions, and the ever-present smoke of damp coal. Today's offering, corned beef, also known as bully beef. A rectangular tin, opened with a key. Inside, pink, gelatinous meat, salted to near permanence, eaten cold with a spoon or spread on hardtack. Some men slice it, fry it on a small metal plate over a candle flame, crisping the edges in an attempt to conjure taste. Others mix it with mashed potatoes when potatoes are available, and shape the mixture into patties. Private Allard watches as one of his mates crushes a biscuit, mixes it with beef, and adds a dab of mustard from a private stash, a treasure traded for half a bar of chocolate last week. The smell, faint but promising, draws curious glances. One man offers a cigarette in exchange for a bite. The cook refuses. He wants to savor this. In the corner of the dugout, someone sings quietly, a lullaby from home. His voice is low, barely above a whisper, but it is steady. The song winds around the meal like a second course. The men listen. No one mocks. Music, like food, is a luxury, and every man knows what it costs. By evening, darkness falls like a heavy blanket. Candles flicker in the dugouts, casting shadows that dance across tin walls and canvas sheets. The last meal of the day is small: a cup of tea, another biscuit, perhaps the last few bites of corned beef saved from earlier. Some men chew slowly, stretching each bite like a prayer. There is quiet now, not peace, but a kind of stillness. The food may be poor, it may be cold, bland, and sparse, but it is shared, and in that sharing there is something close to comfort. Tomorrow they will rise again in the wet and cold. They will wait for the next tin, the next stew, the next parcel, and they will eat, because to eat is to survive. To eat is to remember. And in this long, quiet war, sometimes that is all a man can do. The third morning comes with a subtle shift. The mist lingers longer than usual, curling low over the parapets like smoke from a forgotten fire. Somewhere beyond the fog, artillery echoes faintly, the rumble deep and irregular, like distant thunder pressing against the eardrums. In the trench, though, the men move slowly, their limbs heavy with the weight of damp uniforms and the repetition of days. And still, amid all of this, thoughts turn to food. Private Thomas Keegan of the Royal Irish Rifles sits hunched in a dugout corner, watching a tiny blue flame flicker beneath a battered spirit stove. He has a mess tin balanced precariously on top, filled with a mix of crushed hardtack and weak tea. It isn't much, just enough warmth to start the day. A small cube of sugar, saved from 2 mornings prior, disappears into the tin. The sweetness will soften the edges of the biscuit and soften, too, the grimness of the morning. Keegan doesn't speak as he eats. He just listens, to the fire's faint hiss, to the squelch of boots on duckboards, to the sharp, cracking laughter of someone telling a story further down the trench. In these moments, Eating is less about hunger and more about ritual. It is a way of tethering himself to something solid, something repeated, when everything else has turned to chaos. The men around him begin to stir with more energy as the cook's assistant arrives with a sack of tins. Breakfast is about to be handed out, if it can be called that. Today's menu includes another round of plum and apple jam, thick and sticky, spread onto coarse biscuits that require careful chewing. Some soldiers pretend it's toast. They warm the biscuit near a fire until the surface is dry and warm, then spread the jam in a thick layer. The warmth doesn't change the taste, but it helps. It always helps. The jam is strangely beloved, not for its quality, but for its constancy. Always the same, always there, always sweet enough to remind a man of his boyhood, when jam came on thick bread at kitchen tables bathed in light. The tins are marked with the words, "Gift of the Canadian People," and though the men have long since stopped reading them aloud, there remains a quiet gratitude in the way each tin is emptied, scraped clean with fingertips or folded biscuits. Near the fire trench, another man, Sergeant Louis Farrow, is brewing tea in an old artillery shell casing, converted into a kettle with remarkable ingenuity. The handle has been welded from wire, and a spout has been added from a bent tin. It holds water well enough, and the black tea inside is rich and pungent. The smell cuts through the damp air like a blade of memory. Farrow pours out mugs, one by one, careful not to spill. He moves with the calm of someone who has done this 100 times, who knows exactly how long to steep the leaves, how much milk to add, how to ration the sugar when supplies are low. As he hands a mug to each man, they offer small nods of thanks. Words are unnecessary. Tea, here, is a currency of care. Meanwhile, down the line, Corporal Malloy, the trench cook, has begun preparing the midday meal. He squats beside a brazier, its coals glowing faintly, as he stirs a massive pot of something that used to be stew. The smell is earthy, pungent, with notes of onions, potatoes, and something less identifiable. Perhaps turnip, perhaps cabbage, perhaps the memory of meat. He drops in a handful of barley and mutters a small prayer that it cooks through. Malloy's job is one of quiet frustration. He is expected to feed over 100 men with whatever ingredients arrive, and those are often sparse, late, or spoiled. Sometimes he is given sacks of flour, a crate of tinned beef, a jar of pickles, and told to make it work. And so he does. His stew is never the same 2 days in a row, but it is warm and it fills the belly. That is enough. On occasion, when there is a lull in the shelling and the supply wagons arrive intact, he is gifted with something rare, fresh produce. A sack of onions, a crate of carrots, even a few heads of garlic. When that happens, the entire trench notices. The stew gains flavor. Men linger longer by the cookhouse, inhaling deeply, pretending they are in a proper kitchen, not a slit of earth on the edge of death. Across no man's land, the German trenches are dealing with their own mealtime rituals. In one sector near Ypres, a group of Bavarian soldiers is gathered around a pot of thick pea soup, Erbswurst, made from compressed pea sausage. It dissolves into water and becomes a pale green sludge, nutritious but bland. They stir it slowly, adding crumbled rye bread for texture and a bit of preserved sausage when it can be spared. One soldier, Otto Weaver, has received a parcel from home. Inside are smoked sausages, still fragrant, wrapped in wax paper and tied with twine. He slices one thinly and shares it with the men. Each slice is savored like gold. It is not just the taste, it is the care behind it. The fact that someone remembered him, packaged this, wrapped it, posted it. That taste, smoky and rich, speaks louder than any letter. In the French lines too, food brings a kind of fragile morale. Their rations often include wine, vin ordinaire, issued regularly, sipped from dented metal cups. It warms the blood, dulls the cold, and loosens tongues. Alongside the wine, French soldiers receive a kind of beef stew, tinned sardines, and brown bread when available. But it is the wine that is most revered. Even a sip brings color to pale cheeks. One French poilu, Jacques Morel, raises his cup in a quiet toast to no one in particular. His comrades raise theirs in response. No one speaks. It is enough to drink and remember what it meant to sit at a cafe in Loire, Marseille, to hear music in the air and smell roasted meat from a kitchen window. That memory lives inside the wine like a secret ingredient. Back in the British trenches, the men gather for their evening ration. The sun is setting behind a curtain of cloud, bleeding light into the horizon. The trench is bathed in a soft, dirty gold. The stew has been portioned out, the biscuits passed along. Some men eat alone, others in pairs or small groups. The silence is companionable, not sad, just tired. Private Keegan finishes his meal and leans back against the trench wall, looking up at the thin strip of sky above. He picks at the last bit of jam in the tin, licks his finger clean and closes his eyes. He is not thinking about the war, or the enemy, or the next patrol. He is thinking of a kitchen with yellow wallpaper, a wooden table with chipped corners, and the sound of his mother's voice as she ladles out stew on a cold winter night. In the dark, surrounded by mud and ruin, that memory is more nourishing than anything else. A light frost settles over the trenches by dawn, turning the mud into a crusted mosaic that crunches beneath heavy boots. The breath of the soldiers rises in plumes, white and brief, as they prepare for another day. A thin shaft of light cuts through a gap in the planks above the dugout, illuminating dust motes that dance slowly in the stale air. It is the kind of morning where every movement feels like it might crack the stillness apart. Inside one of the rear dugouts, a Scottish sapper named Angus Bell tightens his coat and leans over a small parcel wrapped in oilcloth. His hands, rough and blistered from days of digging and hauling timber, tremble slightly as he undoes the string. Inside, carefully packed by a sister back home, is a tin of shortbread. Homemade, crumbly, a little cracked from the journey but still intact. He opens it and inhales deeply, the smell of butter and sugar briefly replacing the stink of earth and oil. He doesn't eat it right away. Instead, he closes the lid and sets it beside him. Just knowing it's there is enough for now. Elsewhere in the trench system, a ration party is moving quietly along the communication trench, their figures outlined against the pale sky. They carry crates of tinned goods, sacks of flour, and boxes of tea. Their boots slip now and then, breaking through the frozen crust and sinking into the wet clay beneath. It's dangerous work. Ration parties are often targeted by snipers or caught in random artillery strikes, but without them, the men in the front line would go hungry. Among the crates are small luxuries, tins of golden syrup, powdered cocoa, and to the excitement of the men, a small shipment of tinned peaches. The peaches are rare, sweet, golden in syrup. They appear maybe once every few weeks, a welcome surprise that is often shared in small spoonfuls, savored like treasure. Rumors spread quickly down the line. There are peaches today, real peaches. Corporal Malloy, the cook, is already at work by the time the crates arrive. He greets the ration party with a grunt and begins to unpack the supplies with the precision of a man who knows exactly what to look for. He sorts the tins by type, meat here, jam there, biscuits stacked neatly. His fingers pause on the peaches, and for a moment he smiles. The last time he had peaches, he gave his portion to a boy from Birmingham who hadn't eaten for 2 days. This time he decides he'll keep just a spoonful for himself. For lunch, Malloy prepares what he calls frontline hash. It's a mix of tinned beef, boiled potatoes, crushed hardtack, and onions when he has them. Today he has half a sack of soft, sprouting potatoes and a single bruised onion. He chops it finely, more for the smell than the taste, and stirs everything together in a large pot over the brazier. It bubbles slowly, releasing a scent that draws men from their dugouts, noses twitching. Sergeant Farrow stops by with his mess tin and watches the mixture swirl. "Looks better than last week's stew," he mutters. Malloy snorts. "You said that last week too." They share a glance. Humor here is currency, just like cigarettes or matches. It keeps the cold at bay, keeps despair from digging in too deep. Later, under a tarp strung between 2 trench supports, a small group of soldiers has created what they jokingly call the Officers Club. It's nothing more than a few crates arranged in a circle, a candle in a jam tin flickering in the center. They sit in relative quiet, sharing a tin of peaches passed around on the tip of a bayonet. Each man takes only 1 or 2 slices. They chew slowly, reverently, eyes closed. The syrup sticks to their lips, sweet and golden. For a few minutes, no one speaks. Then someone breaks the silence with a story about a picnic by a lake before the war. Ham sandwiches, cold beer, sunlight on the water. They all listen, nodding, imagining themselves there, not here. The peaches, the picnic, the laughter, it becomes a single memory shared among them, even if only one man lived it. Far away back at a field hospital behind the lines, wounded soldiers are experiencing a different kind of mealtime. Here, the focus is not just on nutrition, but on comfort. Broths are made from boiled bones, strained carefully. Soft bread, when available, is given to those with injured jaws or broken teeth. Tea is always present, weak but warm. Nurses bring it in large kettles, pouring carefully into chipped mugs. Sometimes, if a soldier is particularly ill, he receives milk thickened with oats or a slice of white bread soaked in beef tea. For many, this is the first proper food they've had in days, not because the front lines are entirely devoid of meals, but because fear and shell shock kill appetite faster than hunger does. In these hospital tents, food is a tether back to the living world, and when a nurse smiles as she sets down a cup of broth, it is sometimes the first kindness a soldier has seen in weeks. Back in the line, the evening approaches. The light fades quickly, turning the trenches into a tangle of shadows. Dinner, such as it is, arrives in the form of more hash, more biscuits, more tea. But tonight, there is something else. The rum ration. A small tot of dark rum, issued in enamel mugs or metal cups, passed hand to hand by NCOs, who make sure each man gets his share. It is not much, just enough to warm the chest, to dull the edges. For some, it's the best part of the day. Private Keegan receives his ration and cradles it in both hands, blowing on it even though it's already warm. He takes a small sip, lets it roll across his tongue. The burn is sharp at first, then mellow. It travels down his throat and settles low in his stomach. His eyes close. He thinks of Christmas Eve years ago, when his father let him taste the brandy in the pudding, just one sip. He remembers the smell, the firelight, the hum of his mother singing. That memory sits alongside the taste of tonight's rum, folded into it like sugar in tea. As the men begin to bed down, rolling into their greatcoats and blankets, the trench quiets. The occasional murmur, a cough, the distant bark of a sentry, but for the most part, it is still. Somewhere, a rat scurries. Somewhere, a tin clinks against a mess kit. And just before sleep takes him, Private Angus Bell reaches over in the dark, opens his tin of shortbread, and eats a single piece. He does not chew quickly. He lets it melt on his tongue, the taste of home, of butter and flour, and hands that cared for him once. Then he wraps the tin back up, tucks it under his coat, and sleeps. The frost deepens overnight, and by morning, the trenches are glazed with a thin sheen of ice. Footsteps echo oddly in the narrow communication trench, as if the walls themselves are shivering. Men emerge from their dugouts with stiff limbs and red noses, breath misting in short bursts as they prepare themselves for another day in the same endless routine. Today, however, is not like the others. There is a murmur running down the line, hushed and eager. It moves like a current, passed from one shivering man to the next. Fresh bread. It seems impossible. Bread is a luxury, a distant memory of bakeries and warm kitchens. Out here, in the mud and ruin, bread rarely appears in its natural form. More often it is replaced by hard biscuits or processed loaves shipped in from behind the lines, stale by the time they arrive, and sometimes full of weevils or mold. But today, the field bakery has delivered. Near the reserve trench, a team of bakers from the Army Service Corps has worked through the night beside mobile ovens mounted on wagons. These steel contraptions are fired by coal and wood and can be moved from sector to sector. They've been hauled here under cover of darkness, far enough behind the lines to be safe, but close enough to deliver. Flour rations were doubled for the occasion. Yeast, saved in tins, coaxed to life in warm water and sugar. Dough mixed by hand under gaslight, fires stoked and watched carefully. Loaves lined up in orderly rows. Now as dawn breaks pale over the frost-bitten earth, the scent begins to drift. Yeasty, warm, slightly sweet. It moves with the breeze and hits the frontline trenches like a blessing. Private Daniel Price is the first in his company to smell it. He stops mid-step, head tilted. For a moment, he believes he's dreaming. But then it comes again, soft and unmistakable. He glances toward his mate, Corporal Jennings, who lifts his nose and grins. Bread? Jennings whispers, awed. Soon the bread arrives, carried in crates covered in burlap to keep in the warmth. The loaves are small, dense, shaped more like bricks than what the men remember from home. But they are soft, freshly baked, and warm enough to steam when broken open. No one speaks as the loaves are passed around, halved and quartered by men too hungry to be polite. Private Price receives his portion and sits on an overturned helmet. He tears it slowly, savoring the feel. It is springy, yielding beneath his fingers. Steam rises gently from the core. He eats it plain, no butter, no jam, and it is the finest thing he's tasted in months. Others dip theirs in tea or smear on the last of their jam rations. Some save a portion, wrapping it in cloth to eat later, but most do not wait. They chew slowly, eyes closed, retreating into the memory of bakery doors swinging open in the early morning, the jingle of a bell, the warm fog inside. In a dugout just beyond the trench line, Sergeant Farrell writes in his journal with gloved hands. His handwriting is tight, spidery. He records the date, the weather, the position of his unit. Then in the corner he adds, "Fresh bread today. Soft, slightly sweet. Never thought I'd taste that again. Men quiet all morning, almost reverent, like church." Even Corporal Malloy, who spent months turning rations into something edible, sits with his own half loaf and eats slowly. No stew today, no mixing or boiling. The men have bread. That is enough. Further along the line, some soldiers try their hand at toast. Using the heat from spent shell casings turned into stoves, they hold their bread on bayonets, careful not to burn it. The result is imperfect, but the smell of toasted crust fills the air with a comfort that makes a few of them laugh aloud for the first time in days. There is a young man named Joseph Milne, barely 19, from Yorkshire. He hasn't spoken much since his brother was killed during a night patrol 3 weeks earlier. But today, with his half loaf in hand, he begins to talk. Not about the war, but about a bakery near his home, run by a woman with white hair and a crooked apron who always gave him the corner slice for free. He tells this story quietly, eyes fixed on the bread, and the men around him listen without interrupting. When he finishes, there's a moment of silence, then one of the older men offers him a second piece, torn from his own share. Milne doesn't refuse. They eat together, shoulder to shoulder, without words. That afternoon, the trench seems changed. It is still cold, still filled with the smell of wet canvas and oil and sweat. But the mood has shifted. There is something in the air that cannot be explained. Not quite joy, but perhaps the shadow of it. And yet, as always, the war presses in. Shells begin to fall again near dusk, sending up plumes of mud and smoke. The men hunker down, helmets on, heads low. But beneath it all, the bread lingers. In their bellies, in their memory, in the scraps tucked into pockets for later. Private Price, lying in his dugout with his coat pulled high, retrieves the last bite of his portion. He eats it slowly, even as the walls shake. The taste is faint now, cooled and mingled with dirt. But still, it is bread, real bread. And for just a moment he forgets where he is. The next day begins in smoke. Not from battle, not this time, but from dozens of small, hidden fires burning low across the trench line. Little tendrils of gray curl up from beneath stoves fashioned from petrol tins, shell casings, and broken crates. The men crouch over them like monks before shrines, sheltering the flickering flames from the wind, coaxing heat from damp coal and wood soaked by days of rain. This morning, breakfast is a more intimate affair. The official rations have not yet arrived. There was shelling on the road last night, and the supply lorries were delayed. But hunger is patient only so long. In their absence, the soldiers have turned to their secret stores, the small caches hidden at the bottom of kit bags or sewn into greatcoat linings. Treasures bartered or saved or received in parcels from home. Private Eli Warner of the Lancashire Fusiliers unwraps a cloth bundle tucked deep within his pack. Inside is a small block of cheese, hard and dry at the edges, but still sharp and fragrant. It came in a parcel from his cousin in Manchester, along with a pair of socks and a bar of soap. He breaks off a corner and lets it rest on his tongue, eyes half closed, savoring the salt, the richness, the distant echo of a civilized meal. Nearby, another man produces a tin of sardines. The label is mostly worn away, but the tin is intact. With the careful twist of a bayonet, he opens it, revealing small silver fish swimming in oily brine. The smell is sharp and strange in the cold air, but to the trench-weary soldiers, it is a welcome change. A spoon is passed, and each man takes a bite, even if only to remember that food could once surprise them. Then there is the cocoa. Corporal Malloy, ever resourceful, has produced a tin of cocoa powder from the bottom of a crate marked for medical stores. He claims it was mislabeled. No one questions him. With a bit of sugar and powdered milk, He stirs a rich, dark drink into a dented kettle and sets it to boil over the brazier. The smell of chocolate rises slowly, carried by the wind down the trench line. It is astonishing, impossible even. Men lift their heads like wolves scenting prey. Eyes widen. Someone murmurs, "Cocoa," with disbelief thick in their throat. When the kettle is ready, Malloy pours it into metal mugs, and for once, no one complains about the portions. Each sip is a small revelation. Sweet, warm, with the soft bitterness of real chocolate. The drink coats the throat, settles in the chest, and for the briefest of moments, the trench feels like something else. Like a memory. Like a dream of a fireside somewhere far from here. Private Warner drinks his cocoa in silence, cupping the mug with both hands, letting it warm his fingertips. As he sips, he remembers a schoolhouse in Lancashire, a winter morning long ago, and the first time he tasted cocoa in a tin cup, handed to him by the headmaster after a long snow walk. The snow had melted off his boots, steam rising in curls, and he felt so very proud to be trusted with the responsibility of cleaning the blackboard afterward. The memory presses against the cold like a second coat. Further down the trench, a few men are experimenting. One stirs cheese into his cocoa, grimaces, then laughs and eats it anyway. Another melts a bit of chocolate into his hardtack, softening it enough to chew. Laughter flickers around the brazier like light. These small moments, absurd and unplanned, are what give the trench its rare texture of life. But for some, breakfast today is harder. In a corner of the line, tucked beneath a canvas awning, a new recruit sits alone with his tin open and untouched. He's barely 18, thin-faced, pale even beneath the dirt. His hands tremble slightly as he tries to eat a lump of beef dripping from a ration tin. The smell turns his stomach. The taste, when he forces a bite, is metallic and sour. He gags quietly, then sets the tin aside. Corporal Farrow notices and joins him, easing down beside him without a word. He doesn't speak at first, just produces a small roll of boiled sweets from his pocket, peels one out, and offers it. The boy hesitates, then takes it. The sweet is red, sticky, faintly fruity. As it melts on his tongue, his shoulders settle. Not by much, but enough. Bit better than bully beef, Farrow mutters. The boy gives the barest smile. Much better. Elsewhere, a group of soldiers are gathered around a small pan, frying slivers of bread in bacon grease saved from a parcel 2 weeks ago. The bacon is long gone, eaten in a single joyful frenzy, but the grease was saved, poured into a jam tin and kept like gold. Now, heated until it sizzles, it transforms the stale bread into something glorious, crispy at the edges, soft in the middle, carrying the flavor of remembered breakfasts. They eat hungrily, passing the pan in a circle. One man hums as he chews, a lullaby his mother once sang as she stirred porridge. Another slaps his knee and calls it the best thing he's tasted since August. A third, the oldest, simply nods and takes a second helping. Food in the trenches is never just about filling the stomach. It is a performance, a comfort, a preservation of identity. Even the smallest variation, a pinch of salt, a drop of syrup, a piece of toast browned in lard, carries the weight of everything that has been lost. Later that morning, a single pigeon lands on the parapet, pecking at the frost. For a moment, no one moves. Eyes track it quietly. Then, with astonishing coordination, 2 men lunge. They miss. The pigeon flutters off with a startled cry, and the men collapse into laughter. One of them rubs his stomach and sighs, "Would have made a fine pie." And for the next half hour, the trench is filled with stories of pigeon pies, roast partridge, and duck fat potatoes. Wild tales, clearly embellished, full of laughter and longing. The hunger is real, yes, but the stories are bigger. They swell to fill the space the pigeon left behind. And in that space, with bellies only half full, the men feel just a little more alive. Afternoon comes with a sky the color of old tin, dull and heavy, pressing low above the trench like a lid on a pot. Rain begins again, a thin, persistent drizzle that soaks through wool and canvas, leaving the men damp to the bone. The trench walls turn slick and sticky and boots vanish into ankle-deep sludge. There is no escape from the wet, only tolerance, and perhaps a few muttered curses offered to no one in particular. In the reserve trench, a break in the monotony arrives not from the weather, but from a sound, a bell, small and high, chiming faintly down the line. At first, no one is sure if it's real, but then it comes again, louder this time. And around the corner comes the source. It is a field canteen cart, pulled by two weary mules and guided by a grizzled quartermaster with a face like a walnut. On the side of the cart is a crudely painted sign, YMCA tea and biscuits. The letters are smudged, the wood chipped, but to the men slogging through the trench, it gleams like gold. The YMCA carts are rare, unpredictable visitors to the front. Staffed by volunteers, they bring not only supplies but comfort, small tokens of home wrapped in steam and sugar. This cart has made it through shell-cratered roads and waterlogged fields to arrive today, and as it stops near the mess station, a line begins to form almost immediately. There are no rations required back, no coupons or signatures, only patience. Inside the cart, a middle-aged woman in a stained apron ladles out mugs of tea from a massive steel urn. Her hands are chapped and reddened by cold, but her eyes are bright, and she smiles with each serving. Beside her, a wiry man with a mustache hands out paper-wrapped parcels, 2 biscuits apiece, lightly sweetened, crumbly at the edges. Private William Davies is third in line. As he takes his tea and biscuits, he nods his thanks. The woman smiles and says softly, "God bless." He carries the mug back to his dugout like a sacred offering, holding it with both hands, his body bent to shield it from the wind. He sits cross-legged on a sandbag, sets the biscuits on his knee, and sips slowly. The tea is strong, milky, and hot. The biscuits are dense but sweet, with a faint hint of cinnamon. It is more than enough. Further along the trench, the YMCA volunteers' presence has stirred something deeper than mere hunger. The men begin to talk, not just the usual muttered observations or weary jokes, but real conversation. They speak of their homes, their mothers, the cafes they once visited on high streets now far behind. They remember the scent of corner bakeries, the warmth of hearths, the joy of unexpected guests. One soldier, Lance Corporal Henry Beauchamp, a Franco-British interpreter, recalls his grandmother's kitchen in Normandy, where each Sunday she baked gâteau de riz, creamy rice cakes scented with lemon zest and nutmeg. As he tells the story, his fingers unconsciously trace the shape of a spoon in the air. Another man, tall and lean, a schoolteacher before the war, shares a tale of an apple orchard in Kent and the way his mother used to bake apples whole, stuffed with currants and cloves. The smell, he says, was like autumn itself. The others listen, nodding slowly, each conjuring their own memory in the soft rhythm of his voice. Corporal Malloy, hearing these stories from his post beside the cook station, decides to add something special to the evening meal. From a crate long untouched, he retrieves a few tins of treacle, thick, dark, sweet as molasses. He mixes a small amount into the day's porridge ration, along with a handful of dried currants scrounged from a Red Cross box weeks ago. The result is something approaching pudding. Not much by civilian standards, but in the trenches, it is a marvel. He doesn't announce it. He simply serves it in silence, ladling the sticky mixture into tin bowls, watching the men's eyes widen as the scent drifts upward, sugar, warmth, and something like memory. For many, it is the first time they've had anything even resembling dessert since arriving in France. Private Davies, still cradling the remnants of his YMCA tea, lifts a spoonful to his mouth. The porridge is thick, sweet, and rich. The treacle clings to the tin, staining it dark. He eats slowly, savoring every bite, chewing the currants until they yield their faint floral tang. A moment later, someone begins humming. It's a tune from home, a lullaby, perhaps, or a Sunday school hymn. The melody is quiet, hesitant at first, but then another voice joins in, then another. Soon, a dozen voices hum together in the fog, over spoons and mugs and the soft clatter of ration tins. The music floats upward, mingling with the smoke from the stoves and the whispers of steam. There are no words, just sound, soft and full, rising against the gray. In a dugout nearby, the young recruit from earlier, still clutching his boiled sweet from yesterday, smiles for the first time since arriving. The sound wraps around him like a blanket, and he leans into it, eyes closed, spoon forgotten in his hand. By evening, the cart has moved on. The volunteers wave goodbye, their cart wheels creaking as they disappear down the road. The tea is gone, the biscuits devoured. But something has settled in the trench, something delicate but enduring. The men bed down with a sweetness on their tongues and a melody in their ears. The pudding may have been simple, but it brought with it a cascade of memories, warmth, and peace. And for one quiet night, the mud feels less like a prison. The trench becomes, in its own quiet way, a kitchen, a hearth, a place where men remember who they were and who they still are. In the deep stillness before dawn, the trench breathes like something alive. It groans and shifts with the sound of men stirring, the rustle of blankets, the scrape of boots against planks. Overhead, the sky begins to lighten, just barely, a faint smudge of ash rising in the east. The air is cold, bitingly so, and carries with it the scent of wet earth, oil, and lingering smoke. This morning, there is no warm breakfast waiting. The cook fires are damp, and the coal is sodden from the night's rain. A shell had landed near the field kitchen just before midnight, and though no one was hurt, the supplies took damage. Flour bags soaked through, tins scattered into the mud, and worse, the tea stores lost to a shallow flood. The fire, when it finally catches, is slow and sullen. Still, the men line up, mess tins in hand, coats pulled tight, eyes half closed from poor sleep. A few have crusts of bread left from the day before, now hard and dry. They chew them carefully, dipping them in cold water to soften them just enough to eat. Others have nothing but silence in their bowls, waiting patiently for what might come. Private Samuel Firth, a clerk from London before the war, sits beneath a sandbag overhang with a pencil in his hand and a ration slip in his lap. He is sketching, rough, quick lines that trace the profile of a comrade asleep beside him. Firth doesn't speak much, but he draws everything, the trenches, the rations, the faces. His small notebook, worn soft by mud and fingers, has become a secret ledger of memory. Today he draws a biscuit, not just any biscuit, but the Army's standard issue hardtack, known by many names, jawbreakers, teeth dullers, cement cakes. It is a square of compressed flour and water, barely edible on its own, nearly indestructible. Firth draws it with care, shading the corners, labeling the cracks. Around the edges of the page, he writes the various ways he has seen men try to eat it. Soaked in broth, boiled with beef, smashed with rifle butt, scraped with bayonet, burned and shaved. In his drawing, the biscuit is monumental, towering like a structure, a monument to endurance. A small joke perhaps, but one whispered to himself. A soldier's humor, dry and sharp as the food itself. Around noon, the stew finally comes. It is thin, watery, stretched beyond its means to serve the full company. Potatoes, if there were any, have dissolved into mush. The meat is mostly gristle, and the grease floats on top like an oil slick. But it is hot, and hot counts for everything in this place. Private Firth lines up with the others, and when he receives his portion, he steps aside and removes from his pocket a small envelope. Inside is a single bouillon cube sent by his sister in a Christmas parcel weeks ago. He crumbles it into the stew, stirs, and waits. The smell changes, richer now, darker, as if made in a real kitchen. The taste is still humble, but no longer empty. He eats it slowly, eyes half closed, letting the warmth seep in. In another corner of the trench, two men are engaged in a quiet act of rebellion. They have scavenged a broken stove from the wreckage of an old supply hut and managed to jury-rig it into something resembling a griddle. One provides the flour, scrounged and hoarded over several weeks, while the other contributes a tin of dripping, rendered fat, saved from dozens of meals. Together they make trench scones. The mixture is crude, just flour, fat, a bit of water. But they flatten it into small rounds and fry it on the griddle until the edge is crisp and the centers puff slightly. The smell draws others in, cautious, curious. A sergeant wanders over, sniffs the air, and shakes his head. "If this gets you lot sick, I'm not carrying you out." They offer him a piece anyway. He eats it in 2 bites. The scones are handed out, small and warm. No one asks for more than their share. The ritual of sharing is sacred. 1 bite, maybe 2, enough to remember, enough to imagine. Firth sketches this too. A man holding a scone like a holy relic, eyes wide with wonder. By mid-afternoon, the rain returns. A light drizzle at first, then heavier, turning the floor of the trench into a ribbon of brown soup. The men retreat into dugouts, pulling tarps over the entrances. Fires go out. The air becomes damp and close, filled with the scent of woolen rust and sour sweat. Inside one dugout, a card game begins. 4 men sit in a circle on crates, a ration tin turned upside down as a table. They play slowly, not speaking much, the flicker of a candle throwing their shadows high against the walls. In the center is a pot, not of money, but of food. A half-eaten chocolate bar, a boiled sweet, a crust of bread wrapped in oilcloth. Each round of cards shifts the pot, the stakes rising not in coin but in flavor. Private Firth watches, sketching them from his corner, noting how their faces change when the chocolate is revealed, how even the losing hand smiles when the winner bites into it and sighs. Outside, the trench breathes again. Men walk slowly, shoulders hunched, eyes down. Somewhere a machine gun barks, answered by one from further down the line. The war never fully sleeps. It just pauses, like a kettle between whistles. As the light fades, the stew is served again, what remains of it ladled out with more water to stretch it further. A few men stir in bits of stale biscuit to thicken it. Others eat it as it is, not out of choice, but because it's easier than hoping for more. Private Firth finishes his last spoonful and adds another page to his notebook. He writes, "Today we made scones from nothing. Today we boiled flavor from memory. Today we remembered what it was to share." Then he closes the book, wraps it in oilcloth, and sets it beside his tin cup. Outside, the trench darkens once more. The men settle into the night, bellies never full, but not entirely empty. Their hunger is tempered by invention, their meals shaped by memory. And even the biscuit, drawn not eaten, becomes a symbol, a hard truth softened by the imagination of those who refuse to forget what real food once meant. Night descends slowly over the line, not with the drama of stars or moonlight, but with a creeping blackness that swallows the landscape whole. In the darkness, the trenches close in tighter, narrower, damp with breath and the press of bodies. Lamps are shaded. Voices fall to murmurs. In this hush, every clink of a mess tin, every rustle of cloth feels louder than it ought. In the far end of the trench, under a sagging plank roof reinforced with corrugated steel, the officers' for dugout is preparing its evening meal. It is not grand, nor significantly different from what the enlisted men receive, but the officers, by rank and routine, maintain certain rituals. These rituals, however modest, form their own brand of comfort. Captain Ernest Harwood sits at a makeshift table fashioned from a door laid over two crates. He is writing a letter to his wife in Kent, describing, with cautious optimism, the condition of his men and the recent calm in their sector. He does not mention the lice. He does not mention the frostbite creeping into a young private's toes, and he certainly does not mention the taste of the stew. Instead, he writes about dinner. "We had something resembling shepherd's pie this evening," he pens with a wry smile. Corporal Burnham managed to layer potatoes over a mixture of beef and what I suspect was more carrot than meat, but it held together and smelled decent enough to suggest a home kitchen rather than a field stove. He does not mention that the potatoes were powdered, reconstituted with muddy water, and thickened with biscuit crumbs, nor does he say that the carrot was turnip, stringy and boiled until translucent. But he writes it that way because it matters, because to describe it as pie is to allow the mind a brief return to the ordinary. At that same hour, a group of men near the front line are gathered around a brazier, not for heat, but for smoke. Private Eli Warner has managed to roll a cigarette using tea leaves, pages torn from an old almanac, and a smuggled pinch of real tobacco gifted by a French soldier earlier in the week. It is an awful cigarette. It burns unevenly, sparks in odd places, and fills the air with a harsh, almost medicinal scent. But it is passed around with reverence. Each man takes a puff, squinting through the smoke, sighing as if it were a Cuban cigar. Alongside the cigarette, a tin of corned beef is open, not the cold, metallic kind eaten with gritted teeth, but one that has been sliced, fried over the brazier until it crisps at the edges and curls like paper. A man named Morgan, a former butcher from Cardiff, slices it with surprising finesse, using a bayonet sharpened to a fine point. He serves each portion on squares of biscuit, softened with rainwater and toasted briefly above the flame. The resulting meal is greasy, smoky, and rich in salt. It is, by trench standards, a feast. They eat in silence, not from solemnity, but from concentration. Every bite is considered, every crumb treasured. There are no seconds, but there are stories. Morgan speaks first. "When I was a boy," he begins, mouth full, "my dad used to make something called singing henny. Bit of flour, fat, currants. Fried it on a stone near the fire. Sang it did. Made this little hiss as it cooked." The men listen, eyes on the brazier. One of them chuckles. "We've got singing rations now. Listen, hear that?" He gestures to the pot, where a sliver of meat pops faintly in the oil. "That's a choir, that is." Another voice joins in with a tale of blackberry picking, of burnt fingers and stained mouths, of a mother's jam bubbling on the stove, while the summer sun poured through gauze curtains. No one interrupts. These are not just stories, they are anchors. Back in the dugout, Captain Harwood finishes his letter, folds it neatly, and slips it into an envelope. He stares at the candle for a long time before blowing it out. The flame gutters, the smoke curling upward into the stale air. Sleep comes late. The ground is too wet, the air too loud with distant shell fire. But eventually, most of the men drift into a half slumber, bodies curled beneath blankets, heads resting on sacks, rifles by their sides. But not all sleep. Private Samuel Firth, the quiet sketcher, lies awake with his notebook open beside him. He has drawn tonight's meal: fried corned beef on biscuit toast, a cup of dark tea, a single square of chocolate offered by a passing chaplain. He writes beneath it, "No one talks of glory, only of gravy." He smiles to himself, a sad smile, and then closes the book. At the same time, in another trench a few miles down the line, a group of French poilus are gathered around their own fire, roasting chestnuts sent from the south. The scent drifts through the trench like a ghost of Christmas, a reminder that in some places the world is still turning, still cooking, still warm. One of them, a farmer from Bordeaux, hums a folk tune as he tosses another chestnut into the coals. The others join in, quiet voices rising into the mist. Across the line, German soldiers eat rye bread and dried sausage, drinking ersatz coffee brewed from roasted barley. One of them pulls out a harmonica. Another lights a lantern. For a moment, even they are home. And above it all, above the smoke and silence and the soft chewing of tired men, the sky stretches wide, indifferent and endless. Food in these trenches has become more than nourishment. It is a shield, a song, a small defiance in the face of vast ruin. And as the night stretches long and the fires dwindle to coals, the men lie still with full bellies, not of food, but of memory. Morning rises late and gray, filtered through a sky so low it seems the clouds might brush against the tips of bayonets. A fine, sticky mist hangs in the air, not quite rain, not quite fog, clinging to every surface until everything, helmets, rifles, even eyelashes, is damp. The trench is quieter today, muffled by the weight of moisture and the weary hush that follows nights of heavy shelling. The earth is raw and churned. Somewhere beyond the wire, a mule brays once, then falls silent. The men stir slowly, as though reluctant to wake in this heavy silence. Breakfast is not served. It is scrounged. Corporal Malloy is absent this morning. He took shrapnel to the leg during the bombardment and now lies in a dressing station a few miles behind the lines. His cook fire is dark, his utensils neatly stacked but untouched. In his absence, the role of cook has fallen temporarily to Private Owen Lister, a young railway porter with no particular skill but a willingness to try. He stands now over a weak fire, stoking it with bits of dry cloth torn from a ruined sandbag. He stares at the contents of a large iron pot, biscuit crumbs, powdered milk, and water, stirred into a pale mush. It is not porridge, not quite. It's something closer to paste, but it is warm, and in the trench, that's more than enough. Private Lister has added a touch of something extra, cocoa powder, just a pinch, not for sweetness, because there's no sugar left, but for scent. He stirs slowly, letting the mixture bubble and thicken, and the faint aroma of chocolate, bitter and smoky, begins to drift up through the trench. Men gather with mess tins in hand, more curious than hopeful. They take their share without complaint, and most eat in silence, heads bowed over their bowls like monks in prayer. The paste sticks to the roof of their mouths. It clings to their spoons, but it goes down and it fills the space where hunger waits. Private Eli Warner sits cross-legged in his dugout, turning his portion over with his spoon. He stirs absent-mindedly, then carefully lays a few broken biscuit pieces on top, arranging them like shingles on a tiny roof. He eats slowly, pretending perhaps that he is tasting something richer. Further down the line, Sergeant Farrow tears open a parcel just arrived from home. Inside, wrapped in wax paper and sealed in layers of newspaper, is a dense fruit cake. The scent escapes immediately. Cloves, cinnamon, candied peel. It floods the trench like music. The men nearby pause. He unwraps the cake carefully, reverently, and then breaks it into small, neat portions. He keeps only a sliver for himself and passes the rest along. No one takes more than they should. A few smell it before eating. Others pop the pieces straight into their mouths and let them dissolve slowly, closing their eyes as they do. Private Lister, still at the cook fire, is offered a piece. He chews slowly, nods once, and says nothing. But when he returns to his pot, he adds a few dried currants from his own tin to the remaining paste. It isn't fruitcake, but it's closer now than it was an hour ago. Near the front line, a group of soldiers are repairing sandbags, their hands chapped and raw from cold. One of them, a tall lad with a coal-dusted face named Barker, produces a small jar from his greatcoat. Inside is dripping, pale, congealed fat saved from bacon long gone. With a knife he sharpened on his boot heel, he spreads a thin layer of it on a piece of toasted biscuit and passes it around. The dripping melts on the biscuit, soaking in, leaving a faint sheen and a whisper of flavor. Barker calls it trench butter. The others laugh, but they eat every crumb. There's a ritual to all of this now, not just to the meals, but to the way food is shared, remembered, spoken of. Recipes are traded like secrets. Family dishes are described with painstaking detail, as if conjuring them from words alone might somehow summon them into existence. Sergeant Farrow, still savoring the last trace of fruitcake on his tongue, begins telling a story about his mother's leek soup, how she simmered it slowly with lamb bones and thickened it with pearl barley. He describes the way the smell filled their stone cottage in the Dales, how she served it with dark bread slathered in butter, how it always tasted better the next day. As he speaks, the others close their eyes. They nod slowly, not just in agreement, but in understanding. They too have stories of kitchens and tables, of smells and textures that seem impossibly far away now. Food has become the tether that ties them to life beyond the wire. A reminder that there was a time before mud and mustard gas, a time when hunger was brief and meals were more than survival. In a quiet moment, as the mist begins to lift and the sun glows faintly through the clouds, Private Samuel Firth opens his notebook again. Today's page is a simple drawing, a single spoon resting on a mess tin. Beneath it, in careful script, he writes, "It is not the food that saves us, it is the sharing of it." The wind stirs the page, and he closes the book softly. Later, as night approaches once more, the fire is stoked higher and the pot is scraped clean. A new ration crate arrives. Inside are tins of makanashi stew, those same familiar slabs of carrot and fatty meat swimming in thick broth. The men groan, joke, roll their eyes, but they eat it. Of course they do. Private Lister, now a cook by necessity, sits by the dying fire and licks his spoon clean. He never liked cooking before the war. But now, as he looks out over the trench, watching men eat and laugh and wipe their mouths on their sleeves, he thinks maybe this is something close to purpose. Maybe in feeding others, he is doing more than surviving. Maybe he is helping them remember that they are still human. And in a place that tries every hour to take that humanity away, that is no small thing. The trench has taken on a different tone today. Not solemn exactly, but subdued. The sky is clear for once, washed pale and colorless by winter's breath, and the air carries a brittle chill that sinks into the joints. The frost has hardened the mud just enough to make walking easier, though every step still echoes with the memory of deeper, wetter days. In the morning light, everything feels exposed. The silhouettes of shattered trees stand like blackened teeth against the horizon. Smoke drifts from behind the ridgeline, a distant shell booms. The usual rhythm of trench life continues beneath it all. Boots scraping, shovels lifting, voices murmuring low. But today, there is talk of something unusual. Mail call. It comes without warning. A single runner, red-cheeked and puffing, arrives from the rear lines, carrying a heavy canvas bag slung over one shoulder. Slapped with stamps, caked in dried mud, stitched and repaired in a dozen places. The bag is dropped near the quartermaster's hut, and within moments, the trench seems to come alive. Men gather instinctively. Some stand quietly, arms crossed. Others mill about, hopeful, hesitant. Few speak of what they're waiting for, but all of them feel it. The distribution begins. Letters are handed out first. Folded envelopes, some neat and precise, others battered and half torn. There are thick ones and thin ones, pages heavy with perfume or faint pencil marks. Some men receive none and drift quietly away, forcing a smile. Others clutch theirs as though they've just been handed a lifeline. Private Eli Warner receives two. One is from his younger sister, written in round looping script full of everyday nonsense. School plays, a new kitten, their father's garden turned to frost. The second is a parcel. He opens it slowly, hands trembling slightly. Inside is a small loaf of dense, spiced gingerbread, wrapped in wax paper and tied with string. The smell escapes first, sweet, deep, laced with cloves and molasses. It fills the trench around him like an incense. He doesn't eat it immediately. Instead, he passes it around. A small piece for Morgan, a sliver for Firth, a corner for the boy with the bandaged hand. Each bite is chewed slowly, reverently, the way one might taste something forbidden. Further down the line, Sergeant Farrow opens a parcel from his wife. Inside are pickled onions, wrapped tight in layers of cloth and wax. He opens the jar and takes in the sharp, vinegary aroma. It is almost too much, too real. The onions are crisp, the flavor cutting through the blandness that's clung to his palate for weeks. He shares a few with those nearby. One man weeps, quietly and without shame, as the taste sparks a memory he hadn't realized he'd forgotten. In another corner of the trench, Private Lister receives his first ever parcel from home. It contains a tin of condensed milk, a knitted scarf, and a folded note from his father that simply reads, "Proud of you. Keep going. Mom says eat well. Here's something for your tea." He holds the tin of milk in his hands for a long time before pocketing it. That night he stirs a spoonful into his cocoa ration. The result is miraculous, creamy, sweet, rich in a way that makes his knees ache with longing. Private Samuel Firth, always watching, always drawing, sketches the scene from a quiet perch above the trench floor. On his page, a line of soldiers each holds something from home, a letter, a wrapped tin, a piece of cake. Beneath it, he writes, "The front shifts, but the hunger is always the same, not for food, for voices." As the sun arcs low across the horizon, meals begin to form around the warmth of parcels and memory. There are sardines in oil, opened with pocket knives and eaten on biscuit corners. A jar of lemon curd is passed around on the blade of a bayonet. A block of fudge, broken unevenly, melts slowly on tongues accustomed only to salt and iron. Corporal Malloy has returned, limping but grinning, his leg bandaged, his coat loose. He's received no parcel, but someone gives him half of a fruit tart wrapped in newspaper. He bites into it and lets out a low whistle. "Proper baking, that is," he says. "Not like the rations we try to pass off as pudding." Later, when the fire is going, he heats up a pot of soup made from tinned meat, dried onion, and one last cube of real stock saved for the occasion. It simmers and steams, rich with the gifts of the day. Someone drops in a chopped up sausage from their parcel. Another adds the remainder of a cheese wedge. The soup becomes a tapestry of generosity. It is shared among many. No one goes without. By nightfall, the trench is quieter again. The parcels have been stashed or eaten. Letters read and reread, some folded into breast pockets, others tucked beneath blankets like charms. The gingerbread is gone. The onion jar passed down to another unit. The cocoa is gone too, thickened and sweetened with memory. But the warmth lingers, not from the fire, nor the soup, but from something else. The knowledge that they are not forgotten. That across the channel, in kitchens and sitting rooms and church halls, people are thinking of them, baking for them, writing to them, remembering them. And that, more than any stew or biscuit or cup of tea, is what fills the hollow space inside. Private Warner lies awake that night, the taste of ginger still on his tongue. He watches the stars through a crack in the trench roof, breath steady, hand resting over his chest where the letter sits, folded and warm. He does not feel full, but he does not feel empty either. The frost has lifted, but only slightly. The ground remains hard underfoot, cracked in places where the sun has touched it, brittle and sharp like the shell of something long dead. The trench, though no longer a mire, still stinks faintly of rot and oil and rust. But today, there is a brightness in the air, not just in the weather, but in the way the men move, the way their voices rise just a little more freely above the trench walls. Word has spread, a field kitchen is coming up the line. Not a cook fire or a brazier, not a battered tin or repurposed pot. A real kitchen wagon, complete with wheels and smoke funnel, drawn by horses and manned by a cook squad sent up from the rear echelon. They are bringing something hot, something proper. The news is vague. Rumors spun like thread through the trench system. Some say it's roast meat, others whisper of dumplings. A few dare to dream of stew made with fresh vegetables, the kind that snap between teeth rather than dissolve into paste. Whatever the truth, it's enough to create anticipation. Private Eli Warner stands near the parapet, rubbing his hands together. Not from cold this time, but from the nervous energy that comes when hope brushes too close to reality. He hasn't eaten anything but biscuits and jam for 2 days. The idea of meat, of real, warm meat, is almost too much to hold in his mind without trembling. The kitchen wagon arrives around midday. It creaks and groans as it rolls into position just behind the supply trench. The horses stamp their feet and snort clouds of steam, their harnesses clinking. The cooks leap down with practiced ease, already barking instructions and lifting pots as large as barrels. The smell hits first, rich, savory, dense with onion and pepper. It cuts through the air like a bell. The men gather, forming a line that bends around the trench walls. They wait in silence at first, mess tins in hand, trying not to crowd, trying not to hope too loudly. But the smell grows stronger, and with it, murmurs rise. Corporal Malloy joins the cooks, exchanging quiet words and a handshake. He takes one of the ladles and begins to help with the serving, moving efficiently, but not without care. Each tin is filled with a ladleful of beef stew, thick, dark, generous. Chunks of carrot and potato bob at the surface. A few men blink in disbelief when they see green flecks, parsley. Private Samuel Firth receives his tin and stares into it, stunned. He sits with his back to the trench wall and eats without a word. The stew is hot, the beef is tender, the vegetables still intact, still have texture. And the gravy, thick, almost sticky, clings to the biscuit he dips into it, transforming the dry plank into something like bread. Near him, Private Owen Lister leans back and exhales like a man uncorking a bottle of joy. "I'd marry this stew," he says, eyes closed, chewing slowly. Another soldier grins. "Not before I propose first." Even those who normally eat in silence are speaking now, mouths full, eyes wide, hands cradling their tins like sacred offerings. One man swears he tastes bay leaf. Another insists there's wine in the gravy. Arguments erupt over what cut of meat it is, whether it's horse or beef or mutton. No one really cares. It's hot, it's real, it's food. And then comes the dumpling, just one. Each man receives a single dumpling, white, soft, heavy with flour and suet. They sit on top of the stew like pale little islands. Some soak them immediately, others slice them into quarters, rationing each bite. A few eat them whole in one ecstatic gulp. Private Warner stares at his dumpling for a moment before touching it. He pokes it with his spoon. It jiggles slightly, absorbing gravy. Then he cuts it in half and eats one piece, eyes closed. He does not cry, but he comes close. Around the brazier later that afternoon, men sit with their backs warmed and their bellies full, a rare sense of ease passing between them. For a moment, they look less like soldiers and more like men at a harvest festival, the way they lean into each other, the way they laugh with their mouths still full. Corporal Malloy, despite his limp, seems younger today. He speaks with one of the field cooks about seasoning, about fire temperatures, about boiling versus simmering. The words are ordinary, but the way he says them, like they matter, gives them weight. He has not spoken so passionately in weeks. Private Firth draws again. This time it's a line of men holding bowls, steam rising around them like halos. He writes beneath it, "Today we were fed by hands we could not see, but we tasted care in every bite." That evening, the sun dips behind the ruined tree line and a fog begins to roll in. The trench darkens, but the mood remains buoyant. Someone finds a harmonica. Someone else taps rhythm on an empty mess tin. A few hum along, low and slow. Private Lister boils tea using water he filtered through a spare sock and a handful of charcoal. It tastes faintly of stew, but no one complains. They sip it slowly, letting the warmth settle in their bones. And later, just before sleep, Private Warner pulls a biscuit from his kit, softens it with the last of his gravy, and eats it in silence. He holds the tin to his lips, licking the final trace of stew from its rim. It is not just food he savors. It is what the food represents. That someone, somewhere, decided they mattered enough for this. That effort had been made. That kindness, once again, had slipped through the cracks of the war. And in that warmth, fleeting and fragile as it may be, there is strength enough to carry them one more day. The thaw came slowly overnight, quiet and unnoticed at first, until morning revealed its work. Water pooling at the bottom of the trench, frost receding from the duckboards, icicles slipping free from their frozen grips to shatter softly in the mud. The chill remained, but its grip had loosened, and with it came a smell the men had nearly forgotten: decay. The earth had begun to breathe again, and in doing so, it released everything it had held over the frozen weeks. The sour stench of rot, of moldy cloth and wet leather, rose with the mist, curling through the trench like smoke. Rats scurried with renewed energy, emboldened by the warmth. Their squeals became background noise once more, and any crate of supplies left untended was subject to siege. Despite this, or perhaps because of it, food became more precious. The damp crept into every ration tin, every paper-wrapped bundle, every crust of saved bread. Soldiers began drying biscuits over flame before eating them, not to toast them, but simply to chase the wetness out. Damp bread tasted like mildew. Damp sugar clumped into lumps. Damp tobacco lost its soul. Corporal Malloy, now back to full duty, was the first to take action. He cleared out the cook area with a grimace, tossing spoiled onions, washing tins with boiling water, and setting up a drying line of sorts, a length of wire strung between two reinforced beams, upon which he hung cloth bags of flour and meal to keep them from the floor. He inspected every sack of salt for dampness, poked through every corner of the kitchen supplies, and muttered curses in 3 languages as he found maggots in a bag of oats. Those were burned immediately. The scent, awful and cloying, clung to his coat for hours. Private Eli Warner volunteered to help, mostly because he couldn't sleep. He'd been dreaming in fragments lately. Bread crusts turned to slugs, jam that bled, voices whispering over boiling kettles. Helping Malloy kept his hands busy. He scoured pots, turned tins upside down to dry, and carefully scrubbed his tan with sand and cold water until his knuckles cracked. In return, Malloy offered him something small, a tin of golden syrup, dented but intact. "Go easy with it," Malloy said. "No telling when we'll see another." That afternoon, the men made trench flapjacks. It started as a joke. Warner had taken 2 hardtack biscuits, crushed them with the butt of his rifle, and mixed the crumbs with water and a spoonful of syrup. He rolled the mixture into a ball and pressed it flat against a warm pan, letting it crisp at the edges. The smell was simple, sweet, smoky, familiar. Others gathered around as he repeated the process. Malloy added a pinch of salt and a dot of margarine from a tin he claimed had been rescued from an officer's supply box weeks ago. The result, chewy, slightly sweet discs of warmth. One by one, they were passed around and consumed with quiet amazement. Private Samuel Firth, watching from his usual perch with notebook in hand, wrote, "It is a miracle not of loaves and fishes, but of syrup and ash." Even Sergeant Farrow, skeptical as ever, admitted that the makeshift flapjacks were better than that bloody jam. Near the end of the cooking, a piece of dried apple, saved from a parcel long ago, was chopped into slivers and added to the last flapjack. The lucky recipient was the youngest soldier in the unit, a red-haired boy named Doyle who had just turned 18. He bit into the flapjack with the ceremony of a man biting into wedding cake. The grin that followed remained on his face for the rest of the day. Later, as the evening mist rolled in and the rats grew bolder, the men built a small barricade of crates and sandbags to keep the pests from their food. One man fashioned a rat deterrent from an old boot, a tin bell, and a bit of string. It didn't work, but it made them laugh. With warmth returning and food more vulnerable than ever, the need for preservation became a matter of creativity. Biscuit crumbs were stored in tins alongside matches to keep them dry. Any leftover stew was divided into small cloth-wrapped pouches and buried in the cold earth to keep until the next meal. One soldier, nicknamed Dr. B, claimed to have invented a method for sealing meat inside empty jam jars with melted tallow. No one asked if it was safe. They ate it anyway. Food became more than fuel. It was treasure, experiment, memory, and medicine. In a rare moment of leisure, Corporal Malloy recited a poem he had written on a scrap of old parchment. It wasn't good, not by literary standards, but it struck something in the hearts of those listening. He read it aloud by candlelight while they huddled in their dugout, spoons still sticky with syrup. "O stew of gray and biscuit dry, thy flavor tells me not to cry, but in thy steam and salted frown, I see the hills of my own town." There was a long pause after. Then someone snorted. Then someone else clapped. I'd pay good money for that on a pub wall, someone said. Or in a latrine, another added. The laughter came easily, and no one minded. By the time night fell and the wind picked up again, the trench smelled faintly of burnt syrup and boiled beef. Not pleasant, perhaps, but warm. And in that warmth, a kind of resilience took root. Private Warner lay on his back, coat bundled beneath his head, fingers sticky with sugar. He stared up at the boards above him, listening to the sound of breathing, familiar, close, human. The flapjacks had reminded him of Sunday mornings, of his mother's call from the kitchen, of butter melting down the side of pancakes and syrup running in golden threads across a chipped blue plate. That memory carried him into sleep, and for once, he did not dream of war. The rain returned without warning, not the misty drizzle that usually fell like breath over the trenches, but a sudden, violent downpour that turned the duckboards slick and the latrine pits into lakes. It hammered the earth so hard that for a while no one could hear anything else. Voices were lost to it, boots sloshed through it, and men were reduced to silhouettes moving through steam and spray. By midday, the trench resembled a flooded mine. Sandbags burst. Walls slid inward. Rifles were wrapped in oilcloth, food tins tucked under arms. Every step forward met with the suck and pull of mud. The sky was the color of charcoal. The water tasted like rust. And yet, in the midst of it all, the men still sought out something to eat. Private Owen Lister, his sleeves soaked and cap hanging heavy over his brow, stood knee-deep in water by the cook fire, which he'd managed to shield with a sheet of corrugated tin propped at an angle. Beneath it, the flames hissed and snapped, fighting for breath. Above it, a dented pot hung from a metal rod, suspended over the flickering light. Inside the pot, a miracle was taking shape. It was a simple soup, born from desperation. Crushed biscuit crumbs, a few slices of onion rescued from a broken crate, a piece of dried meat shaved thin and boiled until the water turned a cloudy gray. Salt, precious and nearly gone, was added pinch by pinch. The whole thing smelled faintly of smoke and earth, but it was warm. And warmth in this weather mattered more than taste. Corporal Malloy emerged from the side trench carrying a bundle wrapped in waxed linen. His moustache dripped with rainwater. His boots squelched with every step. Inside the bundle were a few root vegetables, softened turnips, a shriveled carrot, and something that may have once been a beet. Found them near the old supply post, he said, kneeling by the fire, half frozen, half mold, but there's food in them yet. Together, he and Lister peeled the vegetables with the edges of knives. The rain beat down above them, loud and relentless, but within the small lean-to over the fire, a pocket of warmth and purpose held firm. As the vegetables simmered, the smell grew stronger. The soup thickened. Private Samuel Firth arrived next, carrying his notebook tucked under his coat. He had it wrapped in oilcloth, along with a pencil tied to a string. His sketch today was of the fire, its flickering light against rain-black wood, the men hunched near it, the pot steaming like an altar. Beneath the drawing, he wrote, "We cook in the rain because hunger does not wait. We stir water and mud and call it meal, and yet we are full, for we choose not to be alone." The soup was served by tin cup. Each man took his portion in silence, lifting the liquid to his lips, blowing away steam. It tasted like ash and salt and boiled root, but it was hot, and it settled low in the belly like a promise kept. Some chewed the stringy bits of meat with eyes closed. Others dipped biscuit ends into their cups to stretch the experience a little longer. Private Eli Warner found shelter beneath a half-buried ammunition crate. He sat cross-legged, mess tin balanced on his knees, his boots soaking in water that came up past his ankles. He ate slowly, carefully. Between sips, he stared out at the falling rain. It reminded him of school. Not the war, not the meals of home, but those long, wet afternoons when classes ended early, and he'd wait under the eaves of the library for the storm to pass. He'd close his eyes then, too. Listen, just like now. Beside him, Private Doyle, the red-haired boy, had no spoon. He drank directly from his tin, slurping loudly, then grinned. "Like tea," he said, "only thicker and sadder." Warner laughed, an honest laugh that startled even himself. And in that moment, under the constant rhythm of rain on canvas and metal, something shifted. The trench did not grow warmer. The mud did not recede. But the space between the men felt smaller, tighter, more human. Later, when the rain eased into a mist and the fire burned low, someone suggested making toast. Not with bread. They hadn't seen bread in days, but with biscuits held on bayonets above the embers until the edges darkened and the surface crackled. One man found a half-used tin of plum and apple jam and dabbed it onto his biscuit with a muddy finger. "Tastes like pudding," he said, mouth full. "It tastes like war," someone else replied. "And pudding if you've never had real pudding." Laughter again, soft, weary laughter that bounced between the trench walls and disappeared into the trees. That night, when the candles burned low and the rats began to explore the flooded corners, Private Firth wrote one last line beneath his sketch. "Even in the rain, we feed each other. With soup, with stories, with the sound of chewing in the dark." He folded the page, sealed it beneath oilcloth, and rested his head against the wall. Outside, the water trickled and dripped and whispered its way through the trench. The men slept where they could, on boards, against walls, wrapped in blankets that stank of fire and fat. Their bellies were not full, but they were not empty either. They had eaten, they had laughed, and in a world soaked through with loss, that was something worth holding on to. Morning, when it came, arrived with fog, a thick, clinging fog that dulled the edges of the trench and turned every silhouette into a ghost. Men walked in it with hunched shoulders, their breaths lost in the white swirl, their footsteps muted. No birds sang, no distant guns, just the slow drip of condensation from sandbags and the low hum of quiet voices trying not to shiver. It was the kind of morning that made everything taste of damp cloth and sleep. Corporal Malloy, always first to rise, had built the fire low to keep the smoke from giving away their position. A shallow pan sat balanced on an iron grate, and inside, something hissed gently, a mixture of dripping fat and crumbled biscuit. He was making something he called trench toast, though there was no bread involved. Just dry biscuit, fried in whatever fat he could find, pressed flat and browned until it formed a crust. Private Owen Lister sat beside him, turning over a half slice with the edge of his bayonet. "It's not toast," Lister said. Malloy didn't look up. "It's more toast than we had yesterday." That was true. They fried what they had in silence. A ration of bacon grease had arrived the night before, thick yellow, smelling of smoke and salt. Not enough to cook with freely, but just enough to flavor a pan. The biscuits, normally dry and unforgiving, softened in the heat and took on the scent of something comforting. Not quite food, but a memory of it. Private Samuel Firth, emerging from his dugout with eyes still heavy from broken sleep, accepted a piece without question. He bit into it and nodded slowly, already sketching with his mind. It tasted faintly like breakfast. The kind of breakfast that used to be eaten in kitchens with lace curtains and morning sun on the floor. Not hearty, not filling, but enough. Later, as the fog lifted slightly, a Red Cross volunteer arrived at the support trench with 2 parcels wrapped in waxed paper. They were addressed to any soldier in the line, a rare and welcome gift. Inside the first was a tin of condensed milk and 3 pieces of fruitcake, wrapped tightly in linen and still smelling of cinnamon. The second held dried apricots and a jar of lemon marmalade. A murmur passed along the trench. Fruit, real fruit, even dried, was a rarity beyond reckoning. Men gathered in cautious silence, not asking for shares, but simply wanting to see it, to smell it. One soldier reached out, then pulled his hand back, embarrassed by the hunger in his eyes. Sergeant Farrell stepped forward and divided the parcels evenly, cutting each piece of cake into squares no larger than a coin. The apricots were counted, 17 in total, and distributed like communion. The marmalade was passed around on the tip of a spoon, a single dip each. Just enough to remember. Private Eli Warner held his apricot in his palm for a full minute before eating it. He turned it over, felt its leathery skin, the slight give when pressed, then he bit into it, and a burst of tart sweetness filled his mouth. His eyes watered, not from the fruit, but from something else. He swallowed slowly and leaned back against the trench wall, letting the taste linger. Malloy, meanwhile, had stirred the remaining marmalade into the leftover biscuit toast, creating a sticky, sweet paste that clung to the metal spoon like treasure. It was served warm. The smell alone was worth 1,000 tins of bully beef. As they ate, men began to talk, not of the war, not of orders or weather, or when the next shell might fall, but of breakfast, proper breakfast. They spoke of eggs with yolks like sunlight, of sausages sizzling in grease, of toast scraped with butter until it melted in rivers. They remembered the way tea tasted when brewed slowly, with fresh leaves and whole milk, the way jam stuck to the corners of their mouths, the sound of kettles whistling. Private Doyle, red hair matted with mud, told a story about blackberry picking with his sisters in Devon. His voice softened as he described the way his mother made jam, boiled with sugar, poured into jars, sealed with wax and string. She let it cool on the windowsill, where bees sometimes came to sniff the sweetness. Firth listened closely, his pencil flying across the page. "Write that down," Doyle said, grinning, "so I don't forget it." "I already did," Firth replied. Later, as the fog lifted further and sunlight filtered weakly through the boards above, someone began to sing. A quiet song, half remembered, about aprons and breakfast tables. Others joined in, humming more than singing, their voices low and uneven. But it was enough to fill the trench with something close to peace. When the marmalade was gone and the fire burned low, Malloy scraped the last bit of sweet paste from the pan and offered it to Firth. "For the record," he said. Firth took the spoon, turned it over in his mouth, and smiled. "It tastes like orange light." That night, with the fog gone and the stars faint above the trench line, the men slept more easily. Their hunger, for once, had been met not just with food, but with memory, sweetness, and the soft glowing warmth of something shared. And in the dark, someone whispered, "We'll have breakfast again, won't we?" No one answered, but no one said no. Dawn broke with color. For the first time in what felt like weeks, the sun rose clear above the broken horizon, staining the sky with pale orange and quiet gold. The light fell gently over the trench, illuminating the rivulets of drying mud and the damp fabric of coats hung to air. For a few hours, everything glistened. Helmets, rifle barrels, mess tins stacked in rows, and even the puddles took on a kind of shimmer. There was no shelling, no rumble of distant artillery, only bird song, faint and tentative, drifting in from the edges of the wood beyond no man's land. Private Eli Warner stood at the edge of the trench, staring up at the sky as though trying to remember what it meant. He held his mess tin in one hand, empty for now, and in the other, a small, wrinkled letter he'd reread 4 times already. It had come the night before, tucked into a parcel from his aunt, a woman he hadn't seen since he was a boy, but who had remembered him nonetheless. The letter was short, written in a neat, looping hand. "I hope you're warm. Enclosed is something that always made your uncle smile." Wrapped in waxed paper was a bar of dark chocolate, half melted, cracked, and slightly dusty, but intact. Warner had not opened it yet. He held onto it like a coin, like a ticket out of the present moment. Some part of him wanted to wait, to save it for when things were worse. But another part, stronger, simply wanted to taste sweetness in the sunlight. He slipped it into his pocket and turned toward the cook fire. Corporal Malloy was already there, sleeves rolled, stirring a pot with unusual care. He had that look about him, the look that meant he was working on something special, even if the ingredients weren't. A new tin of beef extract had arrived, and he'd boiled it down into a rich, concentrated broth, dark as treacle and twice as fragrant. He was adding things, slowly, precisely. Crushed biscuit to thicken, a touch of dried onion, a dab of mustard from a tin saved for over a month. The whole thing simmered in a low, patient bubble. It smelled like old pubs and Sunday stew, like the air in a kitchen after a roast. "Today's different," Malloy said to Warner as he passed. "Sun's out. Soup ought to feel like a meal, not punishment." Private Owen Lister had rigged a makeshift table near the cook station, just 2 crates and a board, but it gave a sense of purpose. He laid out the bowls, cleaned and warm as if expecting guests. By noon, the sun was high and the soup was ready. Men gathered not in their usual loose queue, but in a kind of circle. They waited patiently, no pushing, no grumbling. Each man received his portion in silence, and each stepped aside with a nod, holding his tin like something sacred. Warner sat near the edge of the trench with his bowl and watched the steam rise. He dipped a biscuit into the broth, watched it soak and darken, then took a bite. It was astonishing, not because of the ingredients, but because of the attention, because someone had taken time, effort, care, because the sun was shining and he could see his own shadow again, because the soup was hot and salty and thick enough to coat the inside of his mouth. A single spoonful made him feel, for just a moment that he wasn't in a trench, that he could have been anywhere, on a bench in a garden perhaps, with the sound of bees instead of bullets. Near him, Sergeant Farrow opened his own parcel from home, a tin of potted meat and a cloth-wrapped wheel of cheese, sharp and dry, but still good. He sliced it thinly with a razor and passed slivers around without comment. Private Doyle bit into his and made a sound somewhere between a groan and a laugh. That, he said, is the taste of civilization. Firth drew them all, the sunbeams slanting across the trench, the steam from the bowls, the curve of a man's smile as he chewed. He drew the cheese, the biscuit crumbling in fingers, the shadow of a spoon across a tin plate. He wrote nothing this time. The drawing, he thought, said enough. Then, as the men finished their meal and stretched in the sunlight, Warner reached into his pocket and unwrapped the chocolate. He snapped it into 5 pieces. He gave one to Malloy, one to Lister, one to Doyle, one to Firth. He kept the last for himself. They ate it slowly. It was bitter and soft, not quite sweet, but smooth enough to melt on the tongue. The taste filled their mouths, silenced their breathing. No one spoke. No one needed to. The sunlight did all the talking. Later, after the bowls were cleaned and the fire was banked, Malloy leaned back and muttered, "If I had a tablecloth, I'd have used it." That evening, someone found an old cork and carved it into the shape of a roast chicken. They set it in the middle of the table, like a centerpiece, and laughed until their sides ached. When night came, it was gentle. The wind was low. The trench was dry. And the men, for once, slept with full bellies and chocolate still on their breath. That day would be remembered, not for what was fought, but for what was shared. A broth, a beam of light, a square of chocolate held in trembling fingers, and the simple, impossible taste of peace. The sun disappeared again. As quickly as it had come, it vanished behind low clouds that thickened over the course of the night and settled into a sky that seemed to sag beneath its own weight. By morning, the trench had returned to its familiar state of shadow and smoke, of cloying moisture and the dull sting of cold fingers gripping metal. The light from the day before felt like a dream, and yet something of it lingered, not in the sky, but in the men. They moved with a slowness, yes, but not the same tired drag of exhaustion. It was more careful now, more deliberate, as though each remembered the taste of chocolate, the warmth of broth, and had chosen not to let it slip away too easily. Corporal Malloy was up early again. He had taken to waking before the rest, lighting the fire in silence, his movements gentle as he stoked the coals and arranged his tins. He no longer cursed the cold aloud. Instead, he hummed a low, tuneless sound, more vibration than melody. It wrapped around the rising smoke like a thread. Today, there was no parcel, no surprise ration from the rear, no Red Cross tin filled with dried fruit or fudge or condensed milk. What there was, a handful of dried lentils, a stale heel of bread, 2 soft onions, and a single bulb of garlic that had gone half to mush. And yet Malloy stared at them as if they were treasure. Private Owen Lister brought him a tin of bully beef and a few sprigs of something green. "Found it growing along the side trench," Lister said. "Might be parsley, might be poison, smells all right." Malloy sniffed it, nodded. "We'll risk it." They chopped the onions into ribbons, crushed the garlic with the flat of a knife, and stirred the lentils into a pot with water drawn from the canisters kept just out of the rat's reach. The beef was added last and was shredded into fibers and browned slightly over the flame. The stale bread was toasted and crumbled in, giving the soup a thickness it hadn't earned. The green leaves went in just before the lid closed. What came out an hour later was a thick, golden brown stew that clung to the spoon like memory. Private Samuel Firth sat nearby, notebook open but untouched. He watched the process unfold like a ritual, each motion precise, each decision quiet but firm. He didn't sketch. Not yet. He simply observed. When the soup was served, it was done without ceremony. One by one, the men took their portions, found places to sit, and began to eat. No one spoke. The steam rose in curls from the tins. The only sound was the scrape of spoons and the slow, rhythmic breathing of men who had forgotten what it meant to eat without thinking of shells. Firth tasted his stew and felt something strange, a kind of softening behind the ribs, a release. He let it linger before writing. "Today we ate nothing special, and yet it was the best thing we could have asked for. We turned rations into comfort, silence into warmth. The trick is not the food, but the hands that prepare it. Later, after the bowls had been wiped clean with biscuit crusts and the last of the soup scraped from the pot, the conversation turned to feasts. Private Doyle leaned back against the trench wall and said dreamily, "I once had goose stuffed with apples and sage. The skin was brown and shiny as a boot. My mom basted it every half hour. Whole house smelled like heaven." Someone scoffed. "Geese don't exist, they're myths, like clean socks and hot baths." Doyle shrugged. "It was real, I swear. She served it with potatoes roasted and dripping, the kind that crack when you bite them, and gravy so thick you could stand a spoon in it." More stories followed. Roast lamb with rosemary, pies with crusts that flaked like snow, boiled puddings wrapped in cloth, treacle tart with clotted cream, cheese so strong it made your nose itch, chutneys and pickles, pickled eggs, pickled onions, pickled everything. Even Sergeant Farrow spoke up, recalling a dish his grandmother made, beef shin stewed for 8 hours until it collapsed into gravy, served over mash so creamy it slid off the plate. The trench for a moment was a dining room, not in sight or smell, but in spirit, a place where everyone remembered being full once, a place where meals were served on china, not tin, where forks clinked on plates, not bayonets against cans. Firth finally put pencil to paper. He drew their faces, not their features, but their postures. Men leaning forward slightly, not in hunger, but in remembrance. He drew a tin bowl with steam that rose in curls and turned into the outlines of things unseen, tables, kitchens, windows with light spilling in. That night, Malloy brewed tea with a sliver of cinnamon bark someone had tucked away in a pouch. It changed the flavor entirely. No longer bitter or stale, it now held a note of sweetness, something almost festive. The men drank it in silence, letting it warm them from the inside. No one said much before bed. The talk of feasts had settled over them like a quilt, heavy and comforting. Private Warner lay with his back to the trench wall, arms folded, eyes half open. He was not thinking of the war. He was thinking of gravy and potatoes, and the way his father used to mop the last of the sauce from his plate with a slice of bread, declaring it a sin to waste even a drop. He smiled at that, and somewhere in the dark, someone whispered, "I'd trade a month's rum ration for a fried egg." A pause. "2 eggs," another voice said, "and buttered toast." They didn't laugh. They just nodded, unseen, into the dark, each man imagining the meal that would come when the war ended, when the trench was no longer home, when food was not survival, but joy. And though their stomachs weren't full, their hearts were closer, their dreams warmer. The stew had done its work. The wind returned with a voice. It rose in the early hours, sliding across the trench like a whisper through cracked lips, carrying with it the smell of turned earth and the distant scent of smoke, not from battle, but from somewhere far behind the lines where stoves still burned in real kitchens. The air was colder than it had been for days, sharp and insistent, threading itself through collars and seams, through the gaps between fingers curled around steaming tins. The trench once again was a place of breath made visible. Corporal Malloy crouched over the fire, coaxing it to life with a piece of twisted paper and the last of the dry kindling. He muttered softly to it, as if the flame might respond better to kindness than to curses. His fingers moved stiffly, swollen at the knuckles, reddened from days of cold and wet. But they worked. They always worked. Private Owen Lister approached with a metal tin tucked beneath his arm, wrapped in a cloth that had once been white. "Found this in the quartermaster's bunker," he said. "It's marked syruped fruit." Malloy raised an eyebrow. "Syrup fruit? That's not a word." "Then it'll taste better." They opened the tin with a bayonet, the edge worn dull from months of kitchen duty. Inside were slices of pear, pale and soft, floating in golden syrup thick as honey. The smell rose up, delicate and sweet, and for a moment both men just breathed it in. "It's a pudding day," Malloy said. They had nothing resembling flour, no butter, no milk, but they had biscuits, crushed and stored in a tin. They had the pears, the syrup, and a small tin of raisins that someone had forgotten in the supply dugout. With these, they made trench pudding. Malloy mixed the biscuit crumbs with a spoonful of the syrup, stirred in the raisins, and mashed the pears until they were soft enough to disappear into the mixture. He pressed it into a dented mess tin, wrapped the top with cloth, and lowered it into a pot of boiling water set at the edge of the brazier. He let it simmer slowly, the lid rattling faintly as steam curled upward in coils. News of the pudding spread down the trench like gossip. Men drifted in pairs and small groups to the cook fire, drawn by the scent and the promise. No one asked for a portion, not yet. They knew better than to expect something free. But they sat nearby, polishing spoons with their sleeves, sipping weak tea, eyes flicking toward the pot with quiet longing. Private Samuel Firth arrived last, notebook already open. He sat cross-legged on a roll of canvas and began to draw the fire, its flickering edge, the glint of metal, the tilt of Malloy's shoulders as he leaned over his work. He did not ask what was cooking. He already knew. When the pudding was lifted from the pot, it steamed like a breath held too long. Malloy unwrapped the cloth slowly, revealing a misshapen mass of syrup-glazed crumbs, golden and soft at the edges. He sliced it with a knife heated in the fire, the blade sliding through it easily. He served it in small pieces, one per man, each no larger than a matchbox. The syrup was ladled over the top, a single spoonful apiece. They ate in silence. The pudding was warm, sweet, sticky in the best way. The raisins gave a burst of flavor. The biscuit, softened by heat and syrup, crumbled on the tongue like cake. For a few glorious minutes, no one spoke, afraid to break the spell. Then Private Doyle let out a satisfied sigh. "That," he said, "tastes like my birthday." Someone chuckled. Someone else clapped Malloy on the shoulder. Firth sketched faster now, trying to capture the curve of a man's lips mid-bite, the look in someone's eyes as they licked syrup from their thumb. Underneath his drawing he wrote, "A feast in a spoon." Memory pressed into warmth. It is not the ingredients that matter, but the care. As the pudding disappeared and the men leaned back against sandbags and crate walls, the conversation shifted. They spoke of desserts. Treacle tart, spotted dick, jam roly-poly, blancmange, jelly that wobbled in bowls. Someone mentioned custard, real custard, not powdered, and the room grew quiet again. One man claimed he once had syllabub at a wedding. Another spoke of clotted cream, thick as butter, eaten with strawberries so ripe they bled red onto the plate. The trench became, once again, a place of kitchens. Firth closed his notebook and listened, eyes half shut. Later that day, the wind picked up again. The warmth of the pudding faded from their bellies, replaced by the familiar gnawing of cold and hunger. But something inside remained. The sweetness, the sharing, the feeling of having eaten not just to survive, but to remember. That evening, before sleep, Malloy tucked the empty tin into his pack. He saved the cloth, washed it carefully, folded it tight. Tomorrow might be rain again, or frost, or fire. But today they had made pudding, and in doing so had fed more than just the body. The frost returned like an old debt. It crept in quietly overnight, settling into every crack, every fold of cloth, every corner of the dugouts where breath steamed and bodies curled beneath damp blankets. The mud had frozen solid again, cracking underfoot like thin glass, and the metal of rifles and mess tins stung to the touch. The trench had gone silent, not from fear, but from the kind of cold that made speech seem wasteful. Lips split easily now, fingers moved stiffly, and boots had to be pried from the feet with knives. Tea cooled too quickly. Fires fought against the still air, their smoke rising reluctantly into the mist. And yet in the midst of this stillness, something stirred at the rear of the line. A box, wooden, reinforced at the corners, stamped with symbols that none of the men could quite read. It had been delivered during the night, passed down by a string of hands until it landed near the cook fire, crusted with frost and mystery. It was heavy, unmarked, but on its side, someone had scrawled in chalk, "For the lads up front." Corporal Malloy knelt beside it with a crowbar. The others gathered around, arms folded against the cold, steam rising from their mouths in ghostly puffs. When the lid came free, it did so with a groan. Inside, tins, dozens of them, some labeled, some not. Beef stew, sardines, jam, butter. And in one corner, wrapped in wax cloth and tied with string, were 4 small loaves of rye bread, dense, dark, and slightly stale. For a moment, no one moved. Then Malloy said, softly, "Well then," and the feast began. Private Owen Lister took charge of the stew tins, heating them 2 at a time over the fire, rotating them like precious cargo. The sardines were passed around with cracked biscuits, eaten straight from the tin, the oil warming in the mouth. The jam, apricot, glowing amber in the sunlight, was spread with fingertips, smeared over bread and biscuit alike. The butter, impossibly, was soft enough to spread. Private Eli Warner broke his loaf of bread in half and gave one piece to Doyle without being asked. The other half he tore into thick, irregular chunks, dipped each into a spoonful of jam, and chewed slowly, eyes half-lidded. He wasn't tasting the trench anymore. He was tasting breakfast. The stew, once heated, filled the trench with a rich, almost festive aroma. Beef and onion, carrot and pepper. The smell so familiar and rare that it made some blink back tears without knowing why. Private Samuel Firth, as always, watched and sketched. He drew the box, the open lid. The men crouched around it like children around a fire. He wrote no words this time. Only lines, curves, the shape of hunger turning into gratitude. Near the brazier, someone produced a tin of cocoa from the bottom of their kit. Another man added a few shavings of dark chocolate from his own parcel. The mixture was stirred into hot water and passed around in small sips, bitter and thick. Needs milk, someone said. Needs cream, said another. Needs a fireplace and a book. They smiled, quietly, gently, as though smiling too hard might wake them from it. Malloy, finally sitting with his own portion, bit into a sardine laid across bread and butter, chewed twice, and muttered, This is indecent." It was said like a blessing. For the rest of the morning, the men remained near the fire, their movements slower now, not from fatigue, but from something heavier and warmer than exhaustion. Fullness. It changed how they sat, how they breathed. Private Doyle reclined with his back against a crate and whispered, "I feel human again." And that word, human, hovered above them like steam from a bowl. Not soldier, not target, not rank or number or uniform, just human. Later, when the food was gone and the fire dimmed, Malloy packed the empty tins with care, stacking them beside the dugout to be buried or bartered. The last piece of bread he wrapped in cloth and placed in a small wooden box, setting it on a shelf like a relic. "Keep it," he said, "to remind us." That night, there were no new shells, no alarms, just wind, soft and dry, brushing through the trench like a lullaby. The men slept easily, deeply, bellies warm, and minds slowed by memory. And the trench, for once, did not feel like a wound. It felt like a place where men had shared something simple, something that fed more than flesh. A box had arrived, and in it proof that the world still held warmth, still held bread, still remembered them. The morning after the box, the trench held a hush not born of fear, nor frost, nor fire. It was the silence of satisfaction, a rare stillness that settled into the bones like a blanket after a long march. The men moved slowly through the line, not sluggishly but gently, as though each step might disturb something fragile and precious they hadn't yet named. Sleep had come easier, the kind of sleep not pulled down by exhaustion, but wrapped in the warmth of full bellies and familiar flavors. For once, there were no dreams of sirens or mud. Corporal Malloy stirred the fire with practiced care, less a cook now than a steward of moments. The pot today was lighter, less ambitious than the stew of yesterday, more modest than the pudding of days before. It held barley and broth, onion peel, a single clove of garlic, and water boiled to clarity. A soldier's breakfast, simple, hot, dependable. Private Samuel Firth was up early, seated near the brazier with a wool blanket over his shoulders, notebook in hand. His pencil moved in slow arcs, recording not faces today, but hands, cracked, dirt-ringed fingers gripping cups, spooning broth, warming near the flames. It was the hands that had held everything. The bread, the spoon, the bayonet, the letters from home. He wrote, "What feeds a man are not just the things he eats, but the things he holds onto between the bites." There were no special parcels today, no mystery tins, no surprises, but someone, Private Doyle, had bartered 2 cigarettes and a piece of soap for a handful of dried mint leaves, gathered from a French supply cart. And so the tea that morning tasted brighter, lighter. As it was passed around in battered cups and repurposed tins, the scent rose, clean and unexpected. It reminded Warner of Sundays, not of church or of hymns, but of the hour after, when the family returned home and the house smelled of boiled linen and lemon polish, of roast lamb and mint jelly, and his mother would sit in the kitchen humming, always humming, as the kettle hissed. He said none of this aloud. He simply cradled his tea, sipped, and remembered. Later, Malloy distributed the last of the rye bread, sliced thin and toasted over the open flame. The butter was gone, but someone had kept a tin of beef dripping sealed beneath their kit. It was soft now, malleable from the warmth, and it spread easily over the crisp surface of the toast. Salted fat, smoke, crumbs, heaven. Private Lister had saved the last spoon of apricot jam from the day before. He spread it on his piece with great care, slicing it into quarters with the edge of a shell casing, and passed 3 of them down the line without a word. This was how it went now. Food was never hoarded, only held until shared. There was a quiet understanding in the ritual. Eat what you have, give what you can, and savor everything. By noon, the trench had dried just enough for the men to gather more openly. Some played cards, their movements slow, more occupied with chewing their breakfast than watching the play. Others wrote letters home, balancing paper on knees, nibbling the ends of pencils. No one mentioned meat. No one asked for sugar. Because today, there was something more precious. Time. Time to eat slowly. Time to lean against warm wood and close your eyes. Time to finish a cup of tea without rushing to cover from shell fire. Time to talk about nothing in particular. Doyle spoke of building a bakery when he returned home. Said he'd name it after the trench. Call it Section B, he said. People will come just to ask why, and I'll serve them toast and mint tea and never tell them the reason. Malloy nodded. You'd need good ovens. I'll build them from bricks of bully beef. That drew a laugh. Even Pharaoh, who rarely indulged in fancy, said he'd come by every Sunday if the bread was thick and the butter cold. As evening approached, a low fog crept along the edges of the trench, curling between boots and around crates. Fires were stoked again. The last of the barley broth was served as a kind of supper, thin but hot, laced with salt and silence. Warner, finishing his portion, reached for his satchel and withdrew something small. It was the last piece of chocolate from the parcel sent days before. He'd kept it, unspoken and untouched, waiting. Not for a better moment, but for a real one. He broke it into shards and passed them out, one by one, as the men huddled close. They took them with murmured thanks, the gesture too familiar now to need ceremony. When Warner placed the last piece into Firth's hand, Firth paused, turned it between his fingers, and whispered, "This is the part they won't believe, that it was the smallest things, this piece of chocolate, a drop of jam, a cup of mint tea, that gave us the strength to go on." And then after a beat, he smiled. Which means we have to remember it, so they don't forget. The fog thickened, the stars dimmed, the trench narrowed once more into darkness and cold and waiting. But inside each man, something still glowed. Not from meat or fire or warmth, but from a day of enough. The next day was marked not by a sunrise, but by a slow unveiling. The sky lightened in degrees, gray to a paler gray, then to something like the color of old wool. There was no warmth in it, only the suggestion of morning. The trench, slick from the overnight mist, glistened in patches where puddles had frozen then cracked beneath boots. The air was still and strange, as if the world were holding its breath. In the dugouts, men stirred reluctantly. There was no bugle, no shouted roll call. Only the soft rustle of blankets, the scrape of tin against wood, the sighs of bodies stretching after too little sleep. Corporal Malloy stood at the cook fire with both hands wrapped around his tin mug, waiting for the kettle to boil. He had no plan today, no recipe, no clever trick. The stores were low, no new rations had come. The box of Wonders from 2 days before had long since been picked clean, down to the last smudge of jam in the corner of the jar. What he had was water, tea leaves, faint and reused, a tin of meat spread, dense and salty, enough for a few slices on hardtack, and matches, dry, for once. Private Eli Warner emerged from the dugout, teeth chattering softly, hands tucked into his sleeves. He nodded toward the fire, then settled beside it, stretching his legs along the duckboards. "No soup today?" he asked. Malloy shook his head. Not even the idea of it. They shared the silence. Nearby, Private Lister was peeling a biscuit with a knife, shaving off the mold, revealing the hard, clean layers underneath. He sniffed it, nodded, then passed it to Doyle, who accepted it like a gift. "You can toast it," Lister said. "If you squint, it looks like bread." Doyle took it to the fire and held it above the flames on the end of a spoon. The biscuit blackened quickly, the edges curling slightly, just enough to soften its sharpness. He ate it slowly, teeth working hard, eyes half shut. Malloy, meanwhile, was spreading the meat paste, thin, metallic but still meat, onto small slices of biscuit for the men nearby. One slice each, no more, no less. He pressed it in with the back of his knife, making sure it reached the corners. Private Samuel Firth wrote quietly, lips moving without sound. Today he was not drawing. His pencil had snapped in the cold, and the lid was too brittle to hold. Instead, he was writing in the margins of an old field report, using the stub of a charcoal stick burned from a previous fire. The paper was already inked with casualty lists, requisition codes, and dates. But between the lines, he wrote this. Today we had nothing new. No parcels, no chocolate, no jam. But the fire was steady, and the tea was warm. And somehow we laughed. Because they had. Somehow. It began when Malloy found a shriveled lemon buried in the bottom of a sack, probably months old, forgotten. He cut it open with exaggerated ceremony. The smell hit them like a slap, sharp, bright, entirely foreign to the trench. Exotic fruit, lads, Malloy announced. Imported, luxury. You're in for a treat. He squeezed a few drops onto a biscuit, passed it around. The puckering of faces was instantaneous. But they laughed, all of them, loud and open-mouthed, the sound of it echoing off the trench walls. For a moment, it felt like a tavern, like a kitchen table at the end of a long night, where the drink had run dry, but the stories hadn't. Warner coughed, wiped his eyes. Haven't tasted lemon since my cousin's wedding. What was she like? Doyle asked. Warner blinked. Who? The lemon. That set them off again. Afterward, as the laughter faded into chuckles and sighs, Malloy took the remaining juice and dribbled it into the kettle. It wouldn't do much, but it would make the tea taste different, and different was valuable. When the tea was poured, they drank it in slow sips, savoring the ghost of citrus that danced at the edge of the bitterness. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The warmth in their bellies, the sting of lemon on their tongues, the echo of laughter in their chests, it was enough. Later, a wind rose over the line, gentle at first, then stronger. It carried with it the low thrum of artillery far off, the faint murmur of something coming. But for now, the trench remained still. Firth folded his paper, tucked it into his coat. Malloy banked the fire. Doyle rubbed his fingers over the blackened spoon, and Warner, head tilted toward the sky, whispered, I don't want to forget this. Not the lemon. Not the biscuit. Not the way their laughter had sounded. Because in a place built to erase, to reduce men to numbers, to strip them of taste and color and memory, a biscuit with meat paste and a slice of lemon had been enough to remind them of who they were, and who they still might be after the war. The rain came again, not in torrents, but in that slow, drizzling persistence that seeped into everything. It dripped through the seams of the dugouts, slid down the collars of greatcoats, softened the trench walls until they slouched inward like tired men. There was no thunder, no lightning, just the constant patter and the sound of boots shifting in puddles. In this weather, the fire was an act of rebellion. Corporal Malloy had shielded it with a metal crate turned on its side, braced with sandbags and wrapped in a torn waterproof cape. The flames sputtered, smoky and unreliable, but alive. And that was enough. The men crouched around it like pilgrims before a shrine. Private Samuel Firth sat with his knees drawn up, notebook dry for now beneath a makeshift oilcloth. His fingers were too cold to write, so he simply observed, committing every movement to memory. The steam from the fire curled around their shoulders, rising into the gray air like incense. His mind wandered to kitchens and churches, to the sound of ladles on enamel pots and the creak of wooden benches. Today's meal was not planned. It was born from fragments. Private Owen Lister had returned from the supply trench with a bag of split peas, damp but usable. Someone had scrounged 3 cloves of garlic, sprouting at the ends but still potent, a single turnip, a handful of dried beef strips, no carrots, no onions, no bread. But Malloy made do. He dropped the beef into boiling water, let it soften into threads, then added the peas and turnip, diced as small as possible. The garlic went in last, smashed flat and stirred in with the back of a spoon. He cooked it slowly, shielding the pot from the rain, muttering to it under his breath as though encouraging it to become more than the sum of its parts. The smell was earthy, familiar. The kind of scent that didn't belong to any one dish, but rather to the idea of a kitchen, warmth, food, safety. As the soup thickened, Private Doyle appeared with a metal flask. He held it up without a word and unscrewed the cap. Malloy sniffed it, raised an eyebrow. Rum? Brandy, Doyle said. Traded for it with a French sapper. Nearly got shot doing it. Malloy chuckled. You want to put that in the soup? Doyle shrugged. Only a splash, for courage. Malloy tipped a little into the pot, just enough to change the color, to add that deep sweetness that hung at the edges of a proper stew. He stirred it slowly, letting the alcohol cook off in the steam. The aroma shifted. The soup no longer smelled of rations. It smelled of care. When it was served, it came in shallow tins, ladled carefully to avoid waste. No one complained about the portion size. They sipped slowly, tilting their bowls to catch every drop. The split peas had softened into a thick paste, the beef tender and smoky, the garlic strong but welcome, and somewhere in the aftertaste, a trace of brandy. Private Eli Warner closed his eyes after the first bite. It wasn't home, not quite, but it was close enough to stir something behind his ribs. Almost tastes like stew, he whispered. Almost tastes like trust, Malloy replied. The rain continued. The sky hung low, but the trench felt less like a wound and more like a place of gathering. The men leaned close, speaking in low voices, trading stories not of battles but of meals, burnt roasts and ruined puddings, arguments over salt, long-remembered birthday cakes. Firth finally found the strength to write. His hands trembled as he scrawled across a dry patch of paper. Today the soup was not good. It was better, because it was shared, because we added risk and laughter, because someone thought to stir it gently. After the meal, they washed their tins in the rainwater pooled near the fire. Malloy scraped the pot clean and tucked the leftovers into a tin for the night patrol. No one asked for seconds. No one needed to. Instead, they lingered. Someone began humming a hymn, quiet and slow, the kind sung at harvests or funerals, where the words were less important than the tune. Others joined in, not singing, just echoing the melody with breath and vibration. It drifted through the trench like smoke, like a blanket, like something older than war. The fire hissed in the rain. Warner rubbed his thumb over the side of his bowl, then held it close to his chest, as though the warmth might soak through. Doyle leaned back, eyes on the sky. You ever notice, he said, how food tastes different when we eat it slow? Farrell, standing near the edge of the trench, said nothing. But he nodded once, and that was answer enough. In that moment, the soup was more than a meal. It was a record, a message, a defiance written in broth and steam. It said we are still here, we are still human, and we still know how to cook in the rain. That night, the wind shifted. It rolled in slow from the east, not violent or loud, but steady, curling through the narrow cuts of the trench like a long sigh. It brought with it a different kind of cold, not the biting kind that gnawed at the fingers, but a hollow chill that settled in the lungs and lingered there like smoke. Men pulled their coats tighter. Fires burned low, muffled by damp wood and cautious hands. Sleep came in fragments. Private Eli Warner dozed in intervals, waking to the sound of footsteps or the creak of the trench walls as the earth settled. Somewhere, a man coughed with a wetness that didn't sound like mud. Somewhere else, a lantern flared briefly, then went dark again. He rolled over, pulling his coat tighter around him, pressing his hands into the hollow of his chest, searching for warmth not in fire, but in memory. He found it in the scent of cloves. It wasn't real, only imagined, but the memory was sharp. His grandmother's kitchen. Cold December nights, oranges studded with cloves, drying on the stove, sweet and spicy, their fragrance clinging to everything for days. He would sit at the table, his legs too short to touch the floor, sipping weak tea with too much milk and sneaking sugar cubes when no one was looking. Now, here in the dark, he longed for that sugar cube more than he had ever longed for anything. By morning, a frost had set in again. The trench was rimmed with white at its edges, and even the rats moved more slowly. The men stirred from their sleep with the slow, aching weight of bones kept still too long. No one spoke much. They moved in silence, gathering near the fire, their breath forming clouds, their faces pale and still marked with sleep. Corporal Malloy stood at the edge of the cook fire, arms crossed, staring at a tin of condensed milk in his hand. "It's the last one," he said. No one replied. He placed it down on the edge of the fire and turned to a sack behind him, pulling out the rest of the day's meager rations. A handful of flour, a pinch of salt, one bruised apple, soft in the middle but still fragrant, a twist of cinnamon bark, dried and cracked, saved from a Christmas parcel sent months ago. He looked at them all together, and his brow furrowed. Then he got to work. There were no eggs, no sugar, no butter, but he mixed the flour with water and salt and pressed it into a rough dough, kneading it with the heel of his palm against a flat mess tin. He sliced the apple thin, removed the worst spots, and stewed the pieces in the condensed milk with a shaving of cinnamon, letting it simmer until the milk thickened and clung to the apple like syrup. The dough, once flattened and rolled, he folded into hand-sized pockets. Inside each, he placed a spoonful of the stewed apple and sealed them shut with his fingers. He fried them one by one over the brazier, turning them carefully until the outside browned and bubbled. The smell alone was enough to quiet every voice nearby. Men gathered without a word, crouching near the fire, as Malloy lifted each pocket from the pan and placed it onto strips of canvas torn from an old satchel. He didn't speak, he just cooked. Private Doyle was the first to eat. He bit in, then froze, chewing slowly, his eyes wide in disbelief. The dough was crisp at the edges, soft in the middle. The apple was warm, sweetened by milk, and softened into something almost like jam. The cinnamon, only a trace, lingered at the back of the throat like warmth in winter. "It's a pie," he whispered. Malloy snorted. "It's a lie, pretending to be a pie." "Then lie to me forever." The laughter that followed was soft, restrained, but full, real. It rippled through the trench like sunlight, warming places that fire couldn't reach. One by one, the men received their share, some cupping the hot pastry in bare hands, others holding it with strips of cloth. No one spoke while eating. They just chewed, swallowed, closed their eyes. Private Samuel Firth didn't draw that day. He just sat with the others, holding his pastry with both hands, warming his fingers as much as his heart. When he finally opened his notebook, hours later, he didn't sketch a face or a hand or a fire. He drew a circle. Inside it, a line, a flame, a swirl of steam. And beneath it, 3 words, something like home. That night, the frost came back stronger. The wind howled just a little louder. The rats returned in greater numbers. But the men lay in their dugouts with a quiet sense of fullness, not of stomachs, but of spirit. They had eaten something made not from rations, but from memory, from a bruised apple and a tin of milk, from flour and hands and care. And even in that frozen, forgotten place, a pie had been born. The final morning came quietly. There was no trumpet of sun through the clouds, no sudden call to arms, no shell breaking the horizon with a scream. Just the slow rise of light behind a wall of fog, turning everything the color of wet parchment. It was a kind of light the men had come to know intimately, soft, pale, and hesitant. The kind that neither promised nor warned. It simply was. The trench breathed with them, as it always had. Private Eli Warner woke first, as he often did now, no longer jolted from dreams but rising gradually, like embers stirred back to life. He sat up, blinking into the mist, the dampness already clinging to his collar, his fingers stiff. His breath came in plumes, slow and measured. He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a scrap of cloth, unfolded it, and revealed the final sliver of biscuit he had saved from yesterday's pie. He ate it without hurry, each bite small, the sweetness long gone, but the warmth of the memory intact. A few feet away, Corporal Malloy was already tending the fire, the smoke coiling up in thin ribbons toward a sky that refused to turn blue. His hands moved without thought now, flint, dried twigs, breath close to flame. He had long ago stopped needing kindling in his spirit to begin the work of cooking. Today, it was instinct. There wasn't much to cook. A half pouch of porridge oats, a few grains of salt, and the last dribble of golden syrup scraped from the seam of a tin. A single potato, sliced thin to stretch it, and one pale strip of bacon, so small it looked like a whisper of the real thing. But Malloy knew the recipe for comfort did not lie in quantity. Private Samuel Firth woke to the smell of oats and smoke. He didn't reach for his notebook. Not yet. Instead, he stood, pulled his coat close, and walked barefoot across the duckboards to the cook fire. He stood beside Malloy in silence. There were no words needed between them anymore. He watched the porridge bubble, watched the potato curl at the edges where the heat kissed it. "What do we call it?" Firth finally asked. Malloy stirred the pot. "Call it the last meal," he said softly. "No, not that." Malloy looked up, eyes ringed with soot and wariness, but then he nodded. "Call it something worth waking for." They served it slowly, one tin at a time, each bowl with a spoonful of syrup, the potato laid like a ribbon on top, the bacon divided into slivers so thin it was more of an idea than a meal. and yet it filled the trench with a smell that was more than hunger. It was ceremony. Private Doyle wept when he tasted it, not because of the food, but because of everything the food had become. It was the voice of home in a spoon. It was the warmth of someone's hands on your shoulders. It was the memory of sitting at a table, legs swinging beneath the chair, hearing the clatter of dishes and the soft murmur of voices that loved you. He wiped his face with a sleeve and kept eating. Around the fire, no one spoke for a long while. Private Lister chewed slowly, his eyes fixed on the pot, as though watching a flame no one else could see. Pharaoh, seated at the edge of the fire's warmth, sipped his portion with quiet reverence, his spoon scraping only the sides, never the bottom. Even the rats seemed to keep their distance this morning, as if understanding that today was not for scurrying. Warner finished his bowl and stood. He looked around at the trench, the splintered boards, the blackened sandbags, the tins and ropes and rusted edges that had made up the architecture of their lives for too long. He turned to the others and said gently, "I think I'll remember this." And they knew he meant it all. Not just the porridge or the bread or the brandied stew, not just the lemon or the biscuit fried over a flame, but the hands that passed food without asking, the fires built in wind and rain, the sharing of warmth and cold and of silence in the dark. Firth reached for his notebook one final time. He opened to the last clean page and wrote, "In the heart of the mud, we made meals. With nothing but tins and knives and memory, we made meals. And in every spoonful, we remembered who we were, and we did not let go." Then he closed the book. The wind carried the smoke upward. A shell burst faintly in the distance, but no one flinched. The war was not over, not yet. But the meal was finished, and it had fed them far beyond hunger.